Hello everyone, it's been a little while but I'm back with a new audiobook for you. Today we have the no music and sound effects version of The Lightning. For those of you listening to the early ad-free version of this video, thanks so much for joining my Ream subscription and supporting the channel. It's much appreciated. For those of you new to my channel, my name is James E. Wisher and I'm the author of 43 novels spanning epic fantasy, urban fantasy, and science fiction. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'll be adding more audiobooks as time goes by, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And if you'd like early ad-free access, you can join my Ream subscription, link in the description. One other item of note, if you see any of my audiobooks on a channel other than this one, please let me know, since whoever posted it doesn't have permission to do so. Okay, now that the introduction's out of the way, let's get started.
Chapter 1 Graduation. Frederick St. Cloud stood at the head of a line of 320 warlords. Soon the master of the citadel would arrive and call his name. He was graduating at the top of his class. Lucky for him, since his father, Dornkirk, wouldn't have accepted anything less. The son of the king's champion had to live up to high expectations. Not that he held himself to a lower standard than his father. If anything, it was the opposite. He pushed as hard as he could, then kept on going. He knew some of his fellow students thought him obsessive in his training, and they had a point. But if you didn't want to go all out, why bother at all? He looked up and let the bright sun warm his face. Fall still held sway, but soon enough the bitter winter winds would howl down out of the north. Frederick despised winter, but his feelings did nothing to lessen the cold. His gaze darted around the courtyard where he'd spent so much time training over the past 5 years. The gathered seniors waited at the edge of the shadow cast by the towering black walls. Behind them, the keep loomed as hard and unyielding as the masters that trained them. Though he held himself at silent attention, behind him the faint whispers of his classmates came to him. Frederick used soul force to enhance his hearing. "Where do you think we'll get deployed?" He didn't recognize the voice, but he knew the sentiment. Everyone wanted to know where they'd end up tomorrow. "I don't care, as long as it's somewhere warm," another unfamiliar voice said. Frederick generally kept to himself, so there were only a handful of students he knew well. "I suspect I'll be going to the capital," Crown Prince Andrew said. That bright, warm voice was one he'd come to know well over the past 5 years. In addition to completing his own training, Frederick had been assigned to keep an eye on the prince. No one really expected anything to happen, but better to be safe than sorry, Father always insisted. To his surprise, Frederick had come to both like and respect the future king. Andrew lacked the arrogance you often found in the sons of the nobility. Most of it, anyway. A feminine laugh sent lightning racing through Frederick's veins. He'd know that voice anywhere. Helena Court was the most beautiful girl in their class, not to mention the strongest. She wielded a spear like an extension of herself, and her soul force was amongst the densest. Only Frederick and a handful of others defeated her on a regular basis. Andrew liked to joke that knocking a woman on her ass wasn't the best way to court her, but Helena was different. If he went easy on her, it would show a lack of respect for her as a warrior. Nothing else he might do would offend Helena more than that. At last, Commander Connor emerged from the keep with 2 of his lieutenants, one of whom carried a box containing the newly minted warlord's medallions. They wore crisp, blue and white uniforms with swords belted at their waists. With his enhanced vision, Frederick spotted a handful of older warlords watching the assembly. He put them out of his mind when the commander stopped a few feet away. "Frederick St. Cloud?" the commander called. Frederick stepped up. The commander pinned a silver medallion on his chest, and he moved to one side. That was it. All their work, all the years of training, and the only acknowledgement they got was their name called and a simple silver sword pin stuck through their uniform. The whole ceremony took less than an hour. When the last warlord received his pin, Commander Connor said, "The rest of the day is yours. Report tomorrow morning for your first assignments." They all saluted, and the commander took his leave. It was a relief to have the technicalities over with so they could begin their true work. Frederick had barely taken a step back toward the keep when Andrew threw an arm around his neck. "What do you say we go to the in-between to celebrate?" the prince said. Frederick wasn't much for celebrating. "I don't—" "Helena's coming," Andrew added. "Maybe a little celebrating would be okay. Not to mention, the inn was constantly crawling with visiting warlords, so it should be a safe enough place to relax. The in-between was a dingy little tavern 15 miles east of the Citadel. The roof sagged like a run-down plow horse and sported more holes than it did shingles. The front steps appeared in serious danger of collapse, and the less said about the stink swirling around it, the better. Rumor held that so many fights broke out the owner had decided to wait until his unruly patrons destroyed the place so he could build a new one from the ground up. Frederick had serious doubts about that, but it made a good story. Prince Andrew led the way up the steps with Frederick and Helena close behind. The interior of the tavern matched the exterior. Whoever decorated the place had made a concerted effort to spend as little coin as possible. Split-log benches sat beside rough-hewn tables, and 3 hurricane lamps hung from the support posts to provide light in the evening. The staff consisted of a one-legged barman hopping around pouring drinks, and a pair of barmaids whose best days had come and gone before Frederick was born. "Why did you want to come here?" Helena asked. "It's tradition." Andrew led them to a corner table. "You don't want to leave the Citadel before you have a chance to try it, do you?" Helena and Frederick shared a look. For a prince, Andrew had surprisingly lowbrow tastes. When they'd settled in, Andrew waved a barmaid over and ordered a round of ale. The drinks arrived a moment later. Andrew took a sip, winced, and set the mug back down. Frederick and Helena ignored theirs. "So where do you think we'll be assigned?" Helena asked. Frederick shrugged. He had no idea, and didn't especially care. His father might have something planned for him, but he doubted it. Dornkirk St. Cloud was the king's champion and the strongest warrior in the kingdom, yet he spent much of his time standing in the throne room behind Andrew's father and glowering at nobles that didn't have the guts to try anything anyway. Whatever assignment he received had to be better than that. "This was going to be a surprise," Andrew said, "but I guess I can let you in on it. Father wants me to see more of my future kingdom. Tomorrow I return to the capital and then begin a tour of the land. I requested that the 2 of you be assigned as my personal guards." Helena beamed, making her even more beautiful. "I've always wanted to travel the kingdom, so this is perfect. Thank you, Andrew." "Yes," Frederick said. "It should be interesting." Frederick was debating trying to deaden his sense of taste enough to make the ale drinkable when a group of warlords in blue uniforms marched into the tavern like they owned the place. Frederick guessed the age of the 4 men and 2 women to be mid-20s, probably a squad visiting the Citadel between missions. The lead man, his muscles bulging with soul force enhancements, locked gazes with Frederick. The newcomer had spiky blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and looked eager for a fight. He suppressed a sigh and willed the soldier's attention elsewhere. It wasn't to be, alas. The group strode across the almost empty common room and stopped in front of Frederick's table. "You lot must be some of the new meat," the blonde warlord said. "Got your shiny new medallions and imagine you're warriors. How about a little sparring match? You could show us what they're teaching at the Citadel these days." "I'll pass, Senior," Frederick said. That brought a round of laughs. A dark-haired woman put her hand on the leader's shoulder. "There's your answer, John. They're teaching cowardice." Andrew bristled, and his body went rigid. The prince had a short fuse. While he was strong, Frederick feared he wasn't up to dealing with experienced warlords. John turned his attention to Helena instead. "You're a pretty little thing. What do you say we head out back and have a little fun?" "Why don't you go out back by yourself?" Helena said. "Maybe you can find some female companionship in the tavern keeper's pigsty." Andrew snorted a laugh and John's face burned red. Frederick sighed again and drew power from his core. John clamped a hand on Helena's shoulder. "Who do you think you're talking?" Helena's fist crashed into John's mouth, silencing him and sending him flying halfway across the tavern. All the warlords accelerated. Frederick went straight for the biggest man still standing. He swung an uppercut into the opposing warlord's stomach. The man didn't even try to block. He must have thought his iron skin would protect him. Clearly, he'd never been hit by someone with a soul force as powerful as Frederick's. A fist harder than steel and driven with enough strength to crush a stone wall slammed into the arrogant warlord's gut. The breath rushed out of him, and he flew up into the ceiling before crashing back down to the floor. John started crawling back to his feet. Frederick darted over. A kick to the side of the head sent the blonde warlord sliding across the floor. He slammed into the bar and went still. A pained shout drew his attention to Andrew. One of the female warlords had him in a headlock and was pounding him in the face with her free hand. Frederick drew deeper from his core and rushed to his friend's defense. The female warlord's fist went back to deliver another blow. Frederick caught her wrist, twisted, and punched her in the ribs with enough force to bend steel. She grunted and released Andrew. Frederick spun and threw her over his shoulder. She flew across the common room, crashed through the wall, and landed in the yard. "Amberly!" The other female warlord rushed toward Frederick, clearly intent on avenging her fallen comrade. Frederick drew so much power it appeared his opponent was moving in slow motion despite running at warlord speed. He leapt and spun. His foot caught her under the chin and sent her flying out the hole her friend made. Helena had laid out the remaining two warlords, so Frederick turned his attention to the prince. "You okay?" Andrew gave him a thumbs up. The bruises on his face were mostly healed already. Frederick stalked over to John. The leader of the group had pulled himself to his feet, and most of his teeth had regrown. Frederick clamped a hand down on the back of John's neck and squeezed hard enough to let him know that only forbearance kept him from a broken neck. Frederick dragged John over in front of the prince. "You will apologize to His Highness for your rude behavior." John stared at the rapidly healing Andrew for a second. "Your Highness, I did not recognize you, sire. My companions and I only wished to blow off steam. Truly, we meant no disrespect." Andrew gave a lazy wave of his hand. "Oh, don't worry. I wasn't offended in the least. Helena, on the other hand, may require more convincing." Frederick glanced over his shoulder. Helena marched toward them like an approaching tornado. "Hand him over," Helena said in a tone that brooked no argument. Frederick shoved John her way, and she caught him by the ear and twisted. "Ow, ow, ow! I'm sorry, miss. Please forgive my earlier rude comments. We only thought to have a bit of fun." "Fun, huh? I like a bit of fun as well." Helena dragged him toward the back door. Andrew leapt to his feet, winked at Frederick, and hurried after Helena. She dragged John out the door and, without further comment, tossed him into the pigsty. She dusted off her hands and grinned. Now that was fun. The three friends made their way around to the front of the inn. The women Frederick threw through the wall were sitting in the grass, healing their bruises. Neither of them looked overly interested in resuming the brawl. As they walked by, the brunette said, "Wait." Frederick met her gaze. The female warlord had a slim, graceful build, dark skin tone, and bright green eyes. Not unattractive if you overlooked the slowly healing dent in the side of her face. "Who are you?" she asked. "I've never seen anyone move as fast as you did. It was like you were made of lightning." Before he could answer, Andrew stepped up beside him. "This is Frederick St. Cloud, but you can call him Frederick the Lightning." Frederick groaned. A nickname. Terrific. Andrew would never let it go. Still, as names went, the Lightning wasn't the worst he'd ever heard. In fact, he kind of liked it. The outer walls of the palace loomed over them. Andrew led the way through the open gate, drawing salutes from the guards on duty. The best part about traveling with the Crown Prince was no one dared question them. It came as a relief to leave the city behind. Everywhere he looked revealed places for potential assassins to hide. The riot of movement mingled with every scent imaginable to render his enhanced senses almost useless. Crowded city streets were the worst possible place to try and protect someone outside an actual battlefield. They'd barely entered the courtyard when a trio of page boys in blue tabards came running to take their horses. Dust puffed up from their shoes as they skidded to a stop and bowed. They held the companions' reins as they dismounted. Frederick smiled when he caught Helena staring with open awe. She hadn't been to the capital before, and she appeared eager to see everything. Frederick had been here many times over the years. It was unavoidable, given his father's position as king's champion. Not that he minded. Everyone had always been nice to him, even the king. While he didn't want to get caught staring, Frederick found he had a difficult time prying his gaze away from Helena. She changed into one of the slashed blue uniforms favored by female warlords. Whenever she moved, a smooth expanse of thigh or arm peeked through the gaps. His pulse raced at every glimpse. Andrew wrapped an arm around his neck and laughed. "If you start drooling, I won't be able to take you to see Father." The prince released him and sauntered up to the double doors. Helena fell in behind him, pausing to wink at Frederick, who brought up the rear. It seemed he hadn't been as stealthy in his observations as he'd hoped. At least she didn't seem upset. As they walked down the red carpet toward the throne room, Frederick adjusted his sword and smoothed his navy tunic. King Adam had always treated him kindly as a boy, but now that he'd attained the rank of full warlord, he wanted to present himself as a professional soldier. A pair of heavily armed and armored guards pulled the throne room doors open, and the herald announced, "Crown Prince Andrew." Dozens of courtiers dressed in a rainbow of colors filled the throne room. They stood as one and broke into applause. Andrew smiled and waved to the gathering while Frederick scanned for threats. Helena just looked overwhelmed. He didn't worry that she'd be unable to react if danger presented itself. She was every bit the warrior. Andrew led the way down the alley that ran through the center of the room. On a low dais, the king sat on his throne with Frederick's father standing behind him. The king smiled at his son's approach, but father didn't give any reaction. He'd settled into full guard mode, and not a single breath escaped his notice. Frederick and Helena stopped at the end of the aisle and took a knee while Andrew continued on toward the throne. The king rose and clasped his son's shoulders. "Congratulations, Andrew. I've read all the reports, and your teachers to a person are satisfied with your effort. It's been too long since a warlord sat on the kingdom's throne." "Thank you, Father, though I hope the day I assume the throne is still far away." The king smiled. "As do I, son, as do I. Frederick, come here, my boy." Frederick rose and approached the throne. "Majesty." "Graduated top of your class, I understand. No surprise given your heritage. I doubt Dornkirk will ever admit how proud of you he is, so I suppose it falls to me to say it. Well done." King Adam patted his arm. Frederick bowed his head, grateful for the king's acknowledgement, while at the same time wishing his father would offer even a hint of recognizing his skill. It wouldn't happen, of course. Father never offered praise, only ways to improve. "And who is this young lady?" the king asked. "Come closer, my dear." Helena's hands trembled as she approached the throne. She didn't say much about her family, but from the little Frederick had been able to glean, her upbringing had been pretty hand-to-mouth. Only the fact that she had warlord potential had raised her out of the slum where she'd grown up. She managed a passable curtsy. "Majesty." Her voice held steady, even if it was quieter than usual. "No need to be nervous, child. I don't bite, and neither does Dornkirk, despite his appearance. What's your name?" Helena Court. It's an honor to speak to your majesty." She made a close study of her boots, drawing a warm chuckle from the king. The king cleared his throat. "Now, son, the time has come for you to make your official tour of the kingdom you will eventually rule. It's an old tradition for the future king to travel the land for a year in the guise of a commoner. No one will know who you are, which will allow you to see your people as they really are rather than how they wish you to see them. I'm reassured that you have chosen your traveling companions wisely." Frederick blinked. Andrew had mentioned the tour, but not the duration. A year on the road with Andrew would be interesting, but a year on the road with Helena would be amazing. "Now the most important thing," the king said. "To celebrate my son's graduation, we'll be having a ball tonight. I expect everyone to attend." Helena looked Frederick's way. All the blood had drained from her face. She mouthed the words, "I can't dance." Left foot? Right foot? That's good. Frederick rested a hand on Helena's hip as he guided her through the steps of a waltz. Her face had twisted in a determined grimace. He failed to restrain a smile. "You'll scare the other guests if you can't muster a more relaxed expression than that." She glared at him. As soon as the king dismissed the group, Frederick had offered to teach Helena the basics to help her make it through the night. He'd spent enough time at the palace with his father that he knew the basics of all the court's functions, including some simple dances. The servant girls had delighted in teaching him when he visited as a boy. Now he had the pleasure of passing on what he'd learned to Helena. He'd led her to a little out-of-the-way place he remembered from his many hours of wandering. It lay halfway between the kitchen and the firewood room. He remembered it because it always smelled like roasting meat. Today was no exception, as the entire staff rushed around, preparing for the ball tonight. His mouth watered at all the delightful odors filling the air, the apple tarts especially. He hadn't had one of the cook's special desserts in years. Easy for you to tell me to relax. You've been around these people most of your life. Where I grew up, the rich and powerful wouldn't spit on me if I was on fire. This isn't there, and you're not that same girl. You're a warlord now. If you can master sword forms, you can master a few simple dance steps. I've always preferred the spear. Helena rested her head on his shoulder, and Frederick's heart raced. Thanks. He raised his arm, paused, and put it around her. My pleasure. 3 hours later, though still far too soon for Frederick's liking, the lesson ended and they went their separate ways to wash up and dress for the party. Helena's rapid progress came as no surprise given her natural skills as a warrior. It wasn't that big a leap from sword dancing to regular dancing after all. Frederick made his way through the empty halls to the room he shared with his father whenever he visited the capital. The lack of servants threw him off for a minute. Ordinarily, you couldn't take a step in the palace without tripping over one of them. Everyone must be busy preparing for tonight. He pushed the door open and started when he found his father sitting in one of the room's 2 chairs. Father waved him over into the other chair. Frederick took his seat and raised an eyebrow. Something wrong, Father? Not at all. You kept the prince safe for 5 years and graduated at the top of your class. You've met my expectations in every way. Well done. Frederick stared, struck speechless for a moment. Praise, even faint praise, was a rare gift from his father. That meant he had something unpleasant waiting in the wings. It gives me confidence that you'll continue to do an equally good job during his royal tour. My concern is the 3rd member of your party. Is this woman up to her important task? Frederick bristled at the implied insult to Helena, but relaxed a moment later. Father didn't mean it as an insult. He was simply doing his job as king's champion. No need to worry about Helena. She's one of the strongest warriors I've ever fought. Far stronger than Prince Andrew himself. She'll be a fine protector. Father nodded, but the intensity of his gaze didn't waver. And her intentions toward the prince? She isn't looking to seduce him for her own benefit? Now he did let a little annoyance seep into his voice. Helena and Andrew are friends, nothing more. And you and her? Perhaps a little more than friends, though less than I'd like. Father's stern visage finally cracked. She's stunning. Don't let her get away the way I did your mother. That's the one true regret of my life. Faint praise and a hint of regret. That was more emotion than he'd seen from Father in his whole life. Father never talked about his mother. Frederick didn't even remember her. She'd left before he turned 1 and never came back. Was he sick? No. A warlord as powerful as Father wouldn't be troubled by any illness. I'll leave so you can get ready. Father left Frederick to contemplate his odd behavior, at least for a few seconds. His thoughts soon turned back to Helena. He couldn't wait to dance with her for real tonight. Evening arrived, and Frederick found himself scanning dozens of figures for signs of a threat. He didn't really expect to find any, but the act had been pounded into him for as long as he could remember. Nobles weren't the most reliable people in the world. He doubted any of them would hesitate if one decided the king's death would profit him, though the 4 red-robed sorcerers standing against the walls would give pause to anyone considering doing something stupid. Servants circulated through the room, carrying trays of food and glasses of wine. Andrew's and Frederick's fathers stood on either side of the throne as the king greeted each noble as he or she entered. Father kept an eye on the whole affair, as stern and emotionless as a statue. His hand never strayed far from the demon sword's hilt. The threat was unsubtle and unmistakable. Do anything foolish and you'd find yourself in 2 pieces on the floor. A murmur went through the crowd. It took Frederick a moment to pinpoint the cause, but then he spotted Helena. His breath caught. He'd never seen her in a dress before. The pale blue gown complemented her flawless figure, and a simple silver necklace highlighted the smooth skin of her neck. When he recovered his wits, he crossed the throne room and smiled. Wow. I look stupid. You look amazing. Like an angel fallen from heaven. Don't be ridiculous. Despite her protests, Helena smiled and a faint blush covered her cheeks. At that moment, the band struck up one of the waltzes they'd been practicing. Frederick grinned and held out his hand. Shall we? After the briefest hesitation, she took his hand. They fell into the flow of the dance, and for Frederick, everything disappeared except for her. They could have been the only two people in the world. If 100 swords ran him through, he wouldn't have noticed. When the music stopped, she looked past him. Who are all those women surrounding Andrew? He reluctantly released her hand and turned to see what she was talking about. 6 women, each more beautiful than the last, not that any of them held a candle to Helena, surrounded the prince. Andrew looked like a man in need of rescue, but Frederick couldn't fight this battle for him. I believe they're potential wives. He's required to marry next year after all. Why? Securing the line of succession or something like that. Frederick shrugged. I'm not too up on the rules nobles have to live by. My job is to protect him from physical threats. Overeager women are his problem, assuming none of them pull a knife. Considering how sharp some of the looks they're giving each other are, it's a wonder there's no blood on the floor already. Andrew must have noticed them watching as he waved and hurried over, earning several angry glares of his own. What's the big idea, Frederick? Keeping the most beautiful woman in the castle all to yourself? Helena, you're a vision. Best not say that too loud, Helena grinned. Your many admirers might take it the wrong way. Andrew's face twisted. They're nice girls for the most part, but a little too ambitious for my taste. There's one girl, though. She's sweeter than the rest. I don't dare name her lest the others hear and do something to her. Frederick gave the women a sharp look. You don't think they'd do one another physical harm? No, nothing like that. But there are other tricks they can play. I have it on good authority that there's a substance you can slip into a rival's soap that will make her hair fall out. And there's another that when mixed with rouge will cause the victim's face to swell up for days. Charming, Helena said. Where did you hear all this? Before Andrew had a chance to reply, a loud hacking filled the room. All eyes turned to the throne where King Adam had bent in half and clutched his sides as coughs racked his body. One of the Crimson Legion sorcerers rushed over and passed a glowing hand over his back. The coughing eased at once, and the king straightened. The king wiped sweat from his red face and forced a smile. Don't mind me, everyone. Please enjoy yourselves. I believe I'll call it a night. Father guided the king out of the hall as a pair of legionnaires fell in behind them. That didn't sound good, Helena said. No, Father's been fighting that cough for a while now. The healers assure me it's not life-threatening, just stubborn. I'm going to check on him. See you 2 in the morning. Andrew took off after his father, leaving Frederick and Helena staring at his back. Despite the king's best wishes, the ball broke up early and everyone left for their beds. No one had the heart to celebrate while their rulers suffered with an illness. Frederick regretted the loss of time with Helena, but there was no help for it. Hopefully they'd have more chances during their journey. The morning found Frederick and the others up and on their way shortly after dawn. They packed light and dressed in simple peasant garb. Even their horses weren't from the royal stables. The idea of the tour was for the crown prince to see how his people lived and to interact with them on a personal level rather than as a monarch. The tradition had served the kingdom well for centuries. Frederick adjusted his sword and glanced to his left. Andrew yawned and scratched the day's growth of beard he'd neglected to shave that morning. If the rough homespun tunic he wore troubled the prince, he gave no indication. Andrew was probably using iron skin, the same as Frederick. On the road, you needed to maintain basic defensive techniques at all time. You never knew when an arrow might come flying in from the maple trees that lined this stretch of road. He doubted they'd run into trouble a mile from the capital, but you didn't want to develop bad habits. Beyond Andrew, Helena carried her spear couched under her arm like a lance. She hadn't bothered with a dress, instead favoring a man's garb for its ease of movement. The tunic and trousers did nothing to disguise the feminine figure underneath. No one would be mistaking Helena for a man regardless of her outfit. She must have sensed him looking at her because she turned and smiled. Frederick shifted his gaze back to the prince. "How was your father this morning?" "Better. Archmage Samhail performed a healing on him last night. He seemed to think he burned away all the infection, but he's thought that 3 times already." "Some things just need time," Helena said. "As warlords, I think we sometimes forget that." Andrew nodded. "I understand. It's just I hate to see him so weak. Hopefully he'll take it easy and let the ministers handle court business for a while." Frederick barked a laugh. "The only person more stubborn at court than my father is yours. I've got 2 crowns that says he's back on the throne before 2 days is out." Helena looked his way. "You're on. I say he rests for at least a week." They both looked at Andrew, who shook his head. "I suspect he'll be up and out of bed before the day is out." They rode in amiable silence for a while after that, savoring the beautiful fall day. Winter would come soon enough, though if they planned their route right, they should be well to the south before the cold arrived in earnest. Chapter 2. The Queen's Chosen. All around Karash were shades of blue. He strode through the ice tunnels that connected the many chambers of the Palace of Eternal Winter. The Queen had summoned him, and she expected his attendance at once. He flexed his massive shoulders. Even for a frost ogre, the chill of the Queen's home penetrated to the bone. A weakling human would be killed in minutes, but Karash and his kin thrived in the bitter emptiness of his mistress's domain. A patch of ice crunched under his bearskin boots. The days grew shorter, and soon true winter would arrive, and with it, the height of the Queen's power. The time for another war with the humans fast approached. Karash trembled with excitement. Human flesh was the sweetest meat, and he didn't get to partake nearly as often as he'd like. His longest-held wish was to serve as war leader. Karash dared hope that he'd been summoned to receive that task. He would be the one to bring the humans to their knees. He knew it. He rounded a bend and reached the final tunnel leading to the Queen's chamber. Berserkers in their white dragon masks lined the tunnel. As he passed them, a chant went up. "Karash! Karash!" 100 throats roared his name. Boots stomped, filling the passage with thunder. Karash drank it in. He'd earned their adulation dozens of times over, in battles of dominance, leading scores of successful raids. Karash wore his many scars with pride. Each represented a powerful enemy vanquished. He thrust a fist in the air, drawing a long, low howl. At the entrance to the Queen's chamber, he paused to adjust his dragon mask and settled the great sword on his back, a trophy taken from the first human he slew in single combat. Preparations complete, he entered the sprawling oblong chamber. So vast was the space that even with his keen vision, Karash failed to make out the far end. Instead, his gaze drifted to what a first-time observer might mistake for a jagged glacier, until it moved. The Ice Queen opened an eye as big as Karash was tall. Karash fell to his knees before the mighty dragon as she rose on claws capable of rending a mountain to rubble. The 2 of them were alone in the massive chamber. "Rise, Karash." Hearing her speak his name sent an electric thrill through his body. He scrambled to his feet. "Command me, my queen. The time for the next war approaches." Karash controlled his reaction by the narrowest margin. This was it. His dream would soon become reality. "We have lost many battles with the humans, Karash. Decade after decade, they turn aside my mightiest armies. But not this time. This time we strike at the enemy's head, then its body." He frowned behind his mask. "I do not understand, my queen. Will we not send the army south? We will, but not just the army. We will also send small bands into the human kingdom to hunt down and kill their leaders. The chaos will make them weak and uncertain in their response. Our forces will finally have a true advantage, and you will be the key. Karash's heart sank. He was not to lead the army. That great honor would go to another. Whatever you desire, mistress, it will be done. You shall go south and kill the human's king. Bring his head to me, and our army will march with it on a pike. I require 3 other teams as well. You will select 3 berserkers to assist you, as well as the remaining 3 groups. When you've made your choices, you and your 3 companions must come before me again and receive my blessing. Go now, Karash, and choose well. The queen settled back down on her bed of ice and closed her eyes, dismissing him. Karash turned on his heel and marched out of the chamber. He maintained his dignity until well away from the berserkers lining the passage. When he was certain he was alone, Karash slammed his fist into the ice wall, sending small cracks running through it. She wished him to kill a single, miserable human. How could his queen waste her most powerful servant on such a simple task? The human king would have guards, but surely nothing to challenge a team of berserkers. Perhaps if he completed his mission quickly, he could still take his proper place at the head of the army. He pushed away from the wall and stalked on toward the barracks. His mind rushed ahead to the task his queen had set. While he thought it was a waste of his abilities, Karash would never consider giving the queen's task less than his best efforts. The only thing worse than not getting the honor he deserved would be to fail his mistress. He would not let her down, no matter the cost. The barracks where the berserkers slept consisted of nothing but a series of 10 interconnected chambers, each of which housed 50 ogres. They held little in the way of furniture beyond weapons racks filled with spears, clubs, axes, and swords. Furs from bear or muskox softened the icy floor. The few metal weapons were trophies taken from fallen enemies, as the clans had no skill with smithwork. The bulk of the weapons were made from magically shaped ice, every bit as hard as the strongest steel. The cold kept the stink to a minimum, but nothing could fully hide the odor of 500 ogres living in close quarters. Only the queen's elite made their homes in her palace. The regular soldiers, along with the ice trolls, frost giants, and blue drakes, lived in tribes scattered across the tundra. When the time for war came, the queen's mental command would summon whatever size army she deemed sufficient to make the attack against the humans. It was a glorious thing, watching warriors from all the clans gathering for battle. Karash had fought many times amidst the howling hordes before being selected to join her elite berserkers. Some days, not often, but once in a while, he missed those simple days, hunting, killing, mating, with no worries beyond the moment. That had been a simpler life, but nowhere near as satisfying as serving at the queen's side. Karash entered the first chamber and bellowed, "Sakar! Katan! Kolto! Akor! Benai! Wanrei! Come!" It took only moments for his summons to reach the ears of the warriors. They appeared in a swirl of snow. Sakar, Katan, and Kolto were his companions of many years, and would join him on his hunt. The rest were leaders of their own squads and would deal with the lesser targets. Karash was an ogre of few words, so it didn't take long for him to explain to the others their task. "Collect your squads and join us in the queen's chamber." The squad leaders vanished to collect their comrades while Karash led his subordinates back to their waiting queen. As they strode through the hall, Sakar said, "Why does she waste so many of us on such a simple task? I could go myself and collect all the heads our queen might want." Karash darted a glance at the arrogant pup. Sakar was the very embodiment of an ogre warrior, an 8-foot-tall wall of muscle covered in blue skin. Only 2 scars decorated his chest, a testament to his skill in battle. Though strong and dangerous, Sakar thought too highly of himself. The humans didn't overly impress Karash, but there was a reason their army always got driven back, even though one-on-one few humans were a match for an ice troll, much less an ogre. "Perhaps you should tell our queen that she's made an error in judgment," Catan said. "I'm certain she'd value your keen insights." Karash grunted a laugh as Sakar scowled. At only a hair over 7 feet tall, Catan was small, even for a female ogre. What she lacked in size, she made up for in cunning. If it came to a fight, he wasn't certain Sakar would get the best of her. Karash wouldn't let it come to a fight. The queen's mission was all that mattered. "Enough, Catan," Karash said. "I'm sure Sakar wouldn't dream of saying anything negative about our queen." "Never," Sakar said. "Good." Karash looked to Kolto, who hadn't made a sound during the argument. The veteran berserker had overseen Karash's training and was still the only warrior he feared. In one of the rarest events in berserker culture, Kolto had given up his position as squad leader to Karash without a battle for dominance. To this day, his mentor had yet to speak of why he'd done what he did, but Karash felt certain he had his reasons. When they reached the queen's chamber, the 100 berserkers that always guarded the entrance had left. He couldn't remember ever approaching the queen and finding her alone, not that the dragon needed protection from 100 puny ogres. The Ice Queen could kill every living thing in the Northlands without straining herself in the least. Karash led his team inside and found the queen on her feet and waiting for them. Though by no means small at over 8 feet tall, Karash had to crane his neck to look up at the queen's face. She towered over the ogres, her blue scales glittering like gems in the magical light that filled the chamber. All 4 ogres fell to their knees and bowed their heads. "My loyal servants," the queen's voice filled the air, "are you prepared to receive my blessing?" "We are, mistress," Karash said. "The task I've set you will not be easy. I know you imagine humans are weak creatures, unworthy of your respect, and for the most part, you are correct. Some, however, are different. You may have fought them, or witnessed them rain death down on my armies." Karash shuddered at the memory of humans that hurled light from their bare hands. He feared little when it came to battle, but the idea of dying without even coming to blows with his enemy sickened him. "The human king is surrounded by these special individuals. To kill him, you will have to fight them on even terms. My blessing will gift you with the tiniest fragment of my soul force. Prepare yourselves." Jaws wide enough to bite a frost giant in half opened, and her breath washed over Karash and his team. Cold unlike anything he'd ever known settled upon him and sank into his bones. With it came blinding pain. He clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out as the queen's power mixed with his own. Seconds that might have been hours passed before the pain lessened, then vanished altogether. When Karash reached for the energy that had been a part of him for his entire life, he found it changed. He stopped, uncertain how or if he should tap this strange gift. "Raise your eyes, my servants." Karash looked up from the icy floor, glancing left and right as he did. Awe filled the faces of his team. Even the usually superior mug of Sakar hung slack with amazement. Karash gazed at his queen, stunned by the gift she'd shared with him. When his gaze locked with hers, he reeled as the knowledge of everything this power could do filled him. His awe grew by the second. He'd become stronger than any ogre that ever lived. "Now you are ready to complete your task. I know you won't fail me." A faint cough from the entrance drew his attention. The other squads had arrived. Karash shook off his moment of wonder and made his expression hard and forbidding. "Gather around," the queen said. "I will show you what must be done." 3 glowing blue orbs appeared in the air before them. One revealed a bearded human in a tent staring at a map. Another showed a young human with short, dark hair riding a horse beside 2 others. The last showed an old man lying in bed, tended by a pair of young females. "These are your targets. Succeed in killing them, and all hope of the humans defeating our forces will vanish. The first is the commander of the human army protecting their northern border. He's surrounded by that army, and you will need stealth to reach him." "I will slay him without fail, my queen," Wanrei said. The first orb vanished along with the general's image, and the queen continued. "The second is the human's future king. Though only a whelp, he will be a useful figure for the humans to rally behind when the other two are dead." "I will tear his heart out and bring it to you, my queen," Benai said. Sakaar chuckled. "Trust you to choose the weakest target, Benai." The squad leader bristled and bared his fangs. "Do not dare mock me, pup." Sakaar spread his arms as though to embrace the older ogre. The chamber shook when the queen slammed her foot down. "Every target is important." Karash's ears ached at her volume. Trust Sakaar to do something stupid. He snatched the young berserker's scraggly black hair and slammed him face down on the ice. "Forgive my subordinate's foolishness, my queen." The gaze that skewered Karash held no warmth, but when she didn't strike them down on the spot, he relaxed and let Sakaar up. When the second orb vanished, the queen said, "The last is the human king. He rests in their capital, surrounded by warriors and sorcerers. Killing the old human will pose no difficulty. Reaching him is the problem. The remaining team will provide a distraction, so Karash and his team can enter the castle and kill the king. If all is done as I've commanded, I will at long last extend my rule into the human kingdom. Fail, and better you die in the attempt than return to me without the head of your target." Karash flew south, surrounded by an ice-blue aura. He flew. The queen's power surged through him along with the knowledge of how to use it. With such power at their command, nothing could keep them from slaying the human king. The team skimmed the ground lest they draw unwanted attention. He doubted a drake would attack, but with the stupid beasts you never knew for certain. There was no danger of such an attack doing any harm, but it might slow them, and any delay was unacceptable. To be safe, he had Catan flying alone above them to keep watch for any dangers. Behind him, he pulled a bubble holding Acor and his team. Sakaar and Kolto each carried one of the other teams in matching spheres. Everyone had clipped their masks to their belts for the long journey. Only once the enemy was in sight would they don them again. The Queen's palace sat at the top of the world, so even flying it would take 2 days to reach the border with the human kingdom. They would leave Wanrei's team just on this side of it so they could sneak closer in their own time. Sakaar had suggested dropping them right in the middle of the human army, unleashing their newfound powers to wreak havoc, freeing the others to complete their task. He'd barely spoken when the Queen cautioned them that the power she'd shared had limits. Everything they used before reaching the humans' capital would be that much less they'd have to breach the enemy's defenses. When Karash had hesitantly asked why the Queen didn't simply give them more, the great dragon's laughter had shook the cavern and sent the ogres to their knees. She assured them that their feeble mortal bodies could contain no more power than what she'd granted them. None had dared speak again, and soon after, they'd set out on their mission. After 2 days of flying over the endless white terrain, they reached the vicinity of the border, landing about half a day's run from the human kingdom. Wanrei shared a nod with Karash before his team vanished into the snow. The first team delivered. Karash led the others back into the sky. They would swing well wide of the human cities and forts. Should they be spotted, it would make their task much more difficult. They would still succeed, no doubt about that, but Karash saw no reason to make the job harder than necessary. For 3 more hours, they flew along the border. The sun hung low in the sky, and Karash scanned the ground for a likely spot to make the camp before they crossed into the human kingdom in the morning. "Karash!" Catan shouted. "A human!" "Kolto, take my burden." When Kolto had assumed control of his sphere, Karash flew up and joined Catan. "Where?" Catan pointed, and Karash squinted at a dot flying away from them. "Were we seen?" "Yes, I'm sure of it," Catan said. "The human looked right at us, then fled." Karash bared his fangs. "Sakar, Kolto, find a spot to stop for the night. We will join you shortly." Not waiting to find out if the others obeyed his orders, Karash willed himself after the human as fast as his new powers could carry him. Catan fell in beside him, her fangs gleaming in the dusk light. The bloodlust was on her now. Females were always the most beautiful just before a kill. The tiny dot soon resolved itself into a figure which quickly grew big enough to recognize as a human female surrounded by a golden aura. The woman looked back at them, the palpable fear on her face setting his heart racing. A fearful enemy made the sweetest kill. "She's headed for that tower," Catan said. Karash shifted his gaze, only now noticing the stone border tower jutting up out of the snow. He ground his teeth. It would take time to dig the human out of that fortification. Karash didn't want to delay any longer than he had to. Drawing on the knowledge the queen had imparted, Karash gathered power in his hand and hurled an icy sphere at the woman. The human dodged easily and sent a golden lance streaking back at them. The attack slammed into his barrier and disintegrated into golden sparks. He barely even registered the hit. The human was weak, barely worth the time it would take to kill her. A door opened at the base of the tower and the human plunged toward it. Karash and Catan both sent blasts at the shadowy figure just inside the opening, only to see their attacks shatter on a golden barrier. Their prey slipped through the entrance and out of sight. The door slammed shut a moment before Karash landed. He stomped over and slammed his fist into the wood. The door rattled in its frame but showed no sign of weakening. Karash snarled as Catan landed beside him. A golden light streaked out of a narrow slit above them. He braced for an impact, but the light just vanished. Pathetic. "We need to drag them out of there," Catan said, stating the obvious. Karash nodded and slipped his mask into place, prompting Catan to follow suit. "Together." Karash put his hand on the door, and Catan joined him. A pale glow emerged from their hands, and soon a glaze of ice covered the door. They continued to pour precious energy into the barrier. When frost fully covered it, Karash drew back and punched the door again. The frozen wood shattered into splinters. He ducked under the frame and stepped into the tower. He looked back to Catan. "Stay here. Make sure they don't fly away." She snarled behind her mask, but Karash just stared her down until she looked away. He nodded once and continued deeper into the tower. There really wasn't much inside, just a small room with a spiral staircase leading to the next floor. A brief look made it clear he'd never fit his bulk up the stairs. He summoned more power and leapt, smashing through the floor and landing on the broken surface above. A pair of golden blasts struck him the moment he settled down. His blue aura deflected both attacks, but Karash felt his energy dim. He couldn't afford to waste time playing with these weaklings. Calling on his berserker powers, Karash sped up, closing the distance between him and the female he'd been chasing. She didn't even have time to react before his fist crushed her skull. He spun. A trembling, weak-kneed male stared at him. A feeble, golden light surrounded the human, but he made no effort to attack. Karash had seen this before, when his prey knew they'd lost the fight and death was inevitable. "What are you?" the human asked. "I am the Queen's chosen." Karash crossed the small room and twisted the human's head off. He relaxed and removed his mask. The threat was eliminated. Now he needed to return to the others before Sakar did anything stupid. Lon Shin adjusted his crossed legs and tried to focus on meditating like his grandfather had taught him. He shivered despite the heat generated by his soul force aura. Communications duty stunk, no question about that. When he arrived at the Northern Army base, the duty officer had assigned him to a tent so old he suspected it arrived with the ship from the old Empire. Lon increased the power of his soul force aura just enough to make out the recently repaired rent in the canvas. So many patches covered the walls it looked like they'd made the tent out of quilts. For the past month, he'd spent half of every day sitting in a canvas prison waiting for a message. He didn't question the importance of the job, but that didn't make it any less boring. To make matters worse, he couldn't leave during his shift because all the border monitors had this one spot memorized, and they sent all their theoretical messages here. Being sent to serve with the Northern Army hadn't been his first choice when he graduated from the tower last month, but the general needed a third sorcerer to coordinate communications between the 24 scout towers that lined the kingdom's northern border. At least the assignment only lasted 6 months. Then he'd rotate out and some other poor bastard would fill the post. Lon hopped to his feet. No way could he focus on meditating now. His mind raced in the quiet darkness, depriving him of the necessary focus. At the tower, there had always been something new to do or learn, but out here in the middle of nowhere, he'd found only the cold and 20,000 soldiers that didn't like sorcerers. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. It wasn't that the soldiers didn't like him so much as that sorcerers made them uncomfortable. They treated him like a single harsh word would cause him to blast them where they stood. Grandfather would say he should embrace the quiet lest the universe grow offended and send some excitement his way. Sometimes it seemed Grandfather had 1,000 sayings, and that he wanted to be sure Lon heard them all every chance he had. He paused in his ruminations and cocked his head. A burst of soul force was quickly approaching. It didn't have power enough for an attack, so it had to be a message. Now that one had finally arrived, he trembled. Only enemy movement on the border would prompt a lookout to make contact. A golden sphere flew into the tent and vanished, leaving behind a glowing message that read simply, "Help, ogres attacking," along with the number 8. This was it. The enemy had invaded. He had to alert the general. Lon scrambled through the tent flap, wincing in the late afternoon light. He'd barely taken a step when he caught himself. If another message arrived and no one was there to see it, they might lose a vital clue. He ground his teeth. Aaliyah wouldn't be thrilled, but he needed her to fill in for him, at least until he spoke to the general. Lon conjured a message orb, formed a short missive, and pictured the tent he shared with the pinch-faced lady sorcerer. The orb zipped away and Lon headed for the command tent. They only lived 100 yards from the communications tent, so it wouldn't take Aaliyah long to arrive. That's how he justified himself as he ran between tents, ignoring the stares of the soldiers as he worked his way deeper into the camp. Finally, the sprawling command tent appeared. 2 pages stood outside beside the flap and a blue and white flag flapped overhead. "Can we help you, sir?" the page on the right asked. "I need to speak to the general," Lon said. "A message just came in from one of the border towers." A widening of the boy's eyes was the only sign he gave of understanding the seriousness of the situation. The pages both took hold of the tent flap and held it open for him. Lon nodded and ducked inside. In the main chamber, General Cordwright stood over the giant map of the Northlands that covered the surface of a great table. Cordwright was a warlord of considerable skill and plenty intimidating at well over 6 feet tall and sporting a bushy black beard. The general looked up from the map and Lon bowed. "Aren't you supposed to be on communications duty?" "Yes, sir. A message just came in. Watchtower 8 has been attacked by ogres." General Cordwright looked back at the map. "That's nearly 1,000 miles from here. What the hell could she be up to out there? What else?" "Sir?" "What else was in the message?" Lon shook his head. "Nothing, sir. My guess is the sorcerer on duty didn't have time to craft a longer note." "Is the war about to start again?" "Don't get ahead of yourself." General Cordwright's calm helped ease his racing heart. "There's no way for a large force to enter the kingdom from here. The mountains are too high and the nearest pass is 500 miles west of that tower. It must be a small group of raiders, but we won't know for sure until you return with a detailed report." "Me, sir?" Lon wasn't afraid of a fight, but any force strong enough to break into the tower and kill the sorcerer on duty might be more than he could handle on his own. The general must have noted his hesitance. "I don't need you to fight. Just scout out the area and see what we're dealing with. If you find a large group, hurry back and we'll send out an expeditionary force to hunt them down." Lon blew out a breath. A quick recon flight would be simple enough. It wasn't like ogres could attack him 1,000 feet in the air. I'll leave at first light, sir. Karash had the others up and in the air just as the first hint of light touched the horizon. All the power he'd expended regenerated overnight, which came as a relief. For a time, he'd feared the Queen simply provided them with a fixed amount of power, and when they'd used it up, that was the end of it. Beside him, Catan flew rigid and aloof, still angry with him for not allowing her a part of the kill yesterday. Unfortunate, but unavoidable. If one of the humans had escaped, the mission may have been put in danger. They all flew even lower to the ground now that they'd entered the human kingdom. Karash focused on the knowledge the Queen had provided on the second target's location. There was a road and trees, but nothing very helpful. Everywhere in this miserable place had roads and trees. They were supposed to be west of the city where the human king lived. That gave him a rough idea of where he needed to go. 3 days had passed since the Queen sent them on their mission, so the target must have gone well beyond the location she showed them. Karash snarled. He'd drop Benai and his team 50 miles west of the capital and let them hunt on their own. It wasn't his task to locate the human pup for them. Human villages became more and more common as they flew deeper into the kingdom. They zigzagged around them so much they hardly made any forward progress at all. Well past high sun, Karash finally landed in a thick grove of evergreens. He turned to Benai.
This is as far as we go. Your target lies to the west and ours to the east. Good hunting.
Benai bared his fangs.
Perhaps we will finish our target and catch up with you.
Karash nodded. As long as the Queen's mission succeeded, he didn't care how it got done.
Careful, Benai, Sakar said. If you lose to a human whelp, your name will be mocked for all time.
Benai's expression turned hard.
When this is over, pup, you will hear my challenge.
Sakar grinned, displaying a mouthful of perfect fangs.
I look forward to it, old one.
Benai growled and disappeared at high speed into the trees. Sakar laughed, but Karash only scowled. It was bad form to act so with a comrade before a battle.
Enough playing, Karash said. We have our own task. Remember the Queen's lesson and work together to make the veil.
Karash and his team surrounded the decoy team and drew on the power provided by their mistress. The group had shrunk enough for them to use the magic to vanish. Shimmering energy surrounded them, and when they flew, it shifted color so they blended into the sky. The group flew toward the human capital, and to anyone looking up, they'd appear as nothing more than another cloud. Half an hour later, the group stopped several miles from the city. With his enhanced vision, Karash watched the figures in red flying above the buildings. The Ice Queen had warned them about the red-robed sorcerers. They were supposed to be stronger than some of the other humans, and if the berserkers flew too close, they would sense their approach. The group landed in a field a handful of miles from the city, maintaining the veil as they did so. Karash turned to Acor.
When you have the red robes distracted, we will make our attack.
Acor nodded. No words were necessary. Karash didn't hold high hopes for Acor and his team surviving this raid, but as long as the king died as well, it would serve their mistress, and no ogre could ask for a better death. Chapter 3. Attacks. Lon powered through the pre-dawn gloom toward Tower 8. So far, he hadn't seen anything resembling an army, and the general considered it unlikely a large force would try to cross the mountains in this area. Lon's gaze slid to the near vertical peaks, and had to agree. Unless the dragon planned to ferry her troops across in the air, there was no way for a sizable force to make the crossing unless they planned to spend months doing it. Most likely, he'd arrive and find the duty sorcerer standing beside some ogre corpses. After they'd shared a story or two, he'd fly back and let the general know everything was under control. He did his best to convince himself, but he didn't believe it. His gut said something terrible happened at the tower, and Grandfather always said to trust that feeling. The sun had fully risen, and the air started to warm when the watchtower came into view. Something had smashed the door open. He flew closer, but still sensed no soul force. If the duty sorcerer lived, he should have noticed Lon's approach and come out. Drawing power from his core and using it to reinforce his shield, Lon landed in the shallow snow in front of the ruined door. Tracks from large feet filled the area. Ogres had been here, no question about that. He conjured a light and stepped into the shadowy interior. Stones and splinters mixed in the center of the first floor. He looked up and found a gaping hole in the ceiling. Power crackled around his hands as Lon flew up into the second-floor chamber. No! He released his power and ran to the nearest body. He didn't recognize the woman. In fact, he doubted anyone would, considering how her head had been smashed in. The body was still stiff, so she hadn't been dead too long. Lon closed her intact eye and went to the second body. The head lay a few feet to one side. According to the duty roster, a male sorcerer had been assigned to the tower. That meant the woman had to be one of the sorcerers assigned to patrol between the towers. Why didn't he pay attention to their names? It didn't really matter now, but he would have liked to know who the unfortunates were. Lon arranged the bodies in some semblance of repose, bowed, and wished them well wherever their spirits had fled. A burst of soul force disintegrated both bodies. Not exactly a proper burial, but under the circumstances it would have to do. He left the tower and studied the tracks outside. They just appeared right in front of the door. No trail leading to or from the area. No fresh snow filled the visible tracks, so it hadn't snowed over them, and any attempt to brush them out would have left some sign. Lon stared up into the clear blue sky. It looked like they'd landed, killed the sorcerers, and flew away again. Impossible, of course. There was no such thing as an ogre sorcerer. At least no one had ever encountered one in all the years the kingdom had been at war with the dragon. He took to the air. Whatever had happened, he wouldn't figure it out standing around here. He'd make a quick patrol of the area and head back to report in. While he begrudged the time, right now Lon had a ton of questions with no answers. At about 100 feet up, he flew in an ever-widening circle. It was a bleak area. Aside from the tower, there was nothing but snow and evergreens. Fortunately, solo postings to the watchtowers only lasted for 2 months at a time. Any longer, and a sorcerer might go mad with so little to do. About 2 miles from the tower, Lon had had enough. An instant before turning toward base, he spotted a large trampled spot in the snow. He flew down and hovered just above the ground. A sizable group had camped here the night before. They'd made no fire, which argued strongly for ogres or some of their allies. And not just one or two. A fair-sized group had stayed there. A brief flight around the perimeter revealed no tracks coming or going. Whatever brought the invaders over the mountain had definitely been in the air. He had to return and warn the general. Apparently, they needed to worry about flying ogres now. Frederick's gaze darted from one side of the deserted road to the other, searching for threats in the shadows of the towering maples. A faint breeze ruffled his hair, and he sniffed, checking for anything out of the ordinary. Of course, he detected nothing beyond a hint of fall flowers. So far today, they'd met a pair of wagons piled high with pumpkins and squash, bound for the capital, but nothing more threatening. He stifled a sigh. How did Father stay focused every second, especially when everything appeared so peaceful? It might all be a lie. Just because you can't see the threat doesn't mean it isn't there. Father loved that saying, one of many he'd pounded into Frederick over the years before he went to the Citadel to begin his formal training. A quick look at the sky revealed nothing more dangerous than a passing crow. If he had to keep this up, it was going to be a long year. "Could you possibly relax?" Andrew asked, dragging his mind out of guard mode. "I can't keep you safe if I don't stay focused." "Heaven's mercy, Frederick. We're only a week out from the capital. These are the safest roads in the kingdom. If you can't enjoy the ride here, I have no hope for you." Andrew had a point, but Frederick knew his duty. Keep the prince safe, his father had said, and Frederick meant to do exactly that. Andrew was free to enjoy his royal tour, but Frederick had no intention of relaxing. Helena laughed, drawing a sharp look from Frederick. "What?" he asked. She waved a hand, trying to cover her smile. "Nothing. It's just listening to the two of you reminds me of my aunt and uncle. They would have argued about the color of the sky just to have the fight." "This is a little more important than the color of the sky," Frederick said. I know, but the feel of it's the same. You two make an adorable couple." Frederick finally smiled and shook his head. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to relax a little. Best not let the ladies back at court hear you say that, Andrew said. They'll have the daggers out for Frederick instead of each other. Helena laughed again, and Frederick tried not to bristle. His friends were just teasing, he knew that. But sometimes their carefree attitudes rankled. His whole life had been a test, where a momentary lapse might bring a word of rebuke if father was in a good mood, or a blow from a training baton if he wasn't. You didn't simply let go of such training in a week, and Frederick wasn't sure he wanted to let it go at all. Harsh as it had been, father's training had kept him safe and strong, and more importantly than that, it kept those precious to him safe. He darted a look at Helena, and her beauty struck him once more. He would do anything to keep her safe. Anything. We should reach the Bright Moon Inn tonight, Andrew blathered happily along. It'll be nice to sleep in a bed again. I'm not familiar with the inn, Frederick said. Have you stayed there before? Once. I was traveling with father to an important gathering in Valcane, and he rented the entire place. It was quite comfortable, as I recall. I was only 10 at the time, so I didn't pay much attention, but hopefully the serving girls are attractive as well. This time it was Helena who jabbed Andrew with a harsh look. What? The whole point of the trip is to get this sort of thing out of my system before I marry. I thought the point was to see how your average citizens lived so you can better appreciate their struggles, Frederick said. Yeah, but that's really just code for sowing the royal oats. He favored Frederick with a pleading look. Right? Frederick shook his head. You don't need my permission to make a fool of yourself. Just be sure not to tell them who you really are. It was barely mid-morning when Lon returned to the army's camp. Everything appeared in good order. The patrols made their rounds, smoke rose from the cook tent, and no one was screaming. Relief washed over him. After the madness at the watchtower, he'd half feared to return and find ogre sorcerers overhead blasting the place to bits. Of course, if they intended to attack the army, they wouldn't have crossed the mountains hundreds of miles away. That brought him back to the question that had dogged him the whole flight back. What were they up to? He landed directly in front of the command tent, and the pages opened the flaps for him without comment. The general paced behind his map table, scowling and clasping his hands behind his back. The moment he spotted Lon, he asked, Well? Lon gave him a quick briefing. When he finished, he added, This is without a doubt something we've never seen before. I feel confident that 10 to 20 ogres have entered the kingdom. General Cordwright scowled and smoothed his beard with his right hand. Flying ogres? How is that possible? I haven't the slightest idea, sir. But it's the only explanation for what I've found. I wish there was some other way it might have happened, but I'm at a loss. The general waved his hand. I don't doubt you, Lon. It's just a hard thing to wrap my mind around. If they have, heaven forbid, ogre sorcerers, why hasn't the dragon ever sent them against us? Kingdom sorcerers are our single biggest advantage. If the enemy had the means to counter them, we'd be finished. My thoughts exactly, sir, Lon said. But the more I try to puzzle it through, the more I realize trying to think like an ogre isn't something I'm capable of. Thank heaven for that. Why don't you take a rest, grab some food, and return to your regular duties? I'll prepare a message to send to the capital just as soon as I figure out a way to tell them that doesn't make me sound like a madman. Lon bowed and took his leave. Flying ogres did sound crazy, but he knew what he saw. He debated returning to his cot, but decided to try and hunt up a snack first. Maybe the cook still had something left over from breakfast. Sausage and a biscuit would be nice. Halfway to the mess tent, multiple flares of soul force burst to life near the camp perimeter. He turned north, trying to track the source. It felt like the power originated beyond the camp. It didn't feel like another sorcerer, so maybe the warlords patrolling the perimeter powered up. What were they up to? With all the recent weirdness, Lon wasn't willing to take a chance that it was nothing. Forgetting his meal, Lon leapt into the air and flew toward the energy sources. He'd barely left the ground when 2 of them vanished. 3 more were snuffed out a second later. He put on a burst of speed. Only death cut off a flow of soul force that quickly. Swirling snow and the clash of steel on steel announced the battle. 5 bodies stained the snow red. More soldiers ran toward the sounds of battle, but they weren't warlords, and would be of no help in this sort of fight. Not that Lon would be either. The combatants moved so fast he couldn't see them to aim a blast. 2 lines appeared in the snow, heading deeper into the camp. Lon raced after them, uncertain if it was the enemy or allies seeking reinforcements. The paths led straight to the command tent. Both page boys lay dead on the ground out front. Heavy blows had cut them nearly in half. From within came the sounds of combat. Lon powered up his shield and stepped through the flap. Once again he found himself confronted by a battle invisible to him. Though powerful, the general faced 2 opponents with potent soul forces of their own. How did he help when he couldn't even see the combatants? Damn it! Lon hated feeling helpless. There had to be some way he could help. General, touch my shoulder and I'll extend my shield to protect you. A moment later, a hand far too big to be human made contact with his soul force barrier. Lon lashed out, sending spears of soul force lancing out into the enemy. 3 missed, but 2 pierced through. A blue-skinned ogre, its face covered by a white dragon mask, collapsed on the tent floor, bleeding from the gut and thigh. Lon blasted its head to ruin so it couldn't heal. Seconds later, another ogre collapsed in front of the map table, 1 arm missing at the elbow and bleeding from a massive gash in its chest. Before Lon could blast it, the brute's head went flying. The general appeared then, a shallow, already healing cut on his left arm, his only injury.
Excellent timing, Lon. I'll give the bastards credit. It takes a certain kind of crazy to try and kill a man in the middle of an army. If they hadn't taken half a second to murder the boys outside, they may have finished me.
We should get you to safety, sir. There are at least 2 more enemies nearby.
Forget safety. General Cordwright brushed past him and out the flap. I need to rally my men and deal with these mad beasts.
Lon sensed the approaching soul force an instant before an unseen blade drove through the general's chest.
No!
The killer ogre appeared for a second. Plenty of time for Lon to blow its head to smithereens. He ignored it as it collapsed and scrambled to heal the general. A cursory look told him everything he needed to know. The blow had bisected the general's heart. With the berserker's strength behind it, even General Cordwright's iron skin hadn't slowed the weapon. Lon slammed his fist on the ground. Why hadn't he extended his shield at once? Damn him for a fool. He'd assumed the other enemies were far enough away that the immediate danger had passed. Stupid, stupid, stupid! Now the general was dead, and he had only himself to blame. At the very least, he needed to figure out why. He took to the air and raced toward the site of the battle. Perhaps the last ogre knew something useful. Lon reached the edge of the camp just as one of the warlords raised his spear to finish off the final attacker. A beam of soul force shot out and wrapped around the man's hand, stopping the tip of the spear inches from the ogre's chest. Wait! I need to question the brute before you kill him. Lon landed several feet away and strode over. The warlord lowered his spear. What can you hope to learn from him? Those creatures are little more than animals. Lon nodded. I used to think that as well, but I fear we've underestimated our opponents. He bound the wounded ogre so it couldn't attack, crouched down and flicked its mask off. Do you understand me? The monster just stared at him. You're wasting your time, sorcerer, the warlord said. Best let me kill the thing so we can resume our patrol. Lon wasn't ready to give up yet. Your companions killed the general. He ignored the gasp from the gathered soldiers and focused on the prisoner. Its lips drew back in a crude imitation of a smile. It did understand. He knew it. Your mission is complete, though your comrades are dead. The ogre made a deep, rumbling gurgle in the back of its throat. It took Lon a moment to realize it was laughing.
Only part of the mission is complete.
Though its pronunciation was crude, the ogre spoke the human tongue clearly enough.
More of your leaders will die today.
Lon cocked his head. Why tell me? More laughter.
Because it's too late for you to do anything about it. Your kingdom will die, human, and the Queen's glorious winter will cover your land forever.
Lon glanced up at the warlord and nodded. The spear fell, piercing the ogre through the heart, killing it instantly. What does it mean? The warlord ripped his spear from the dead ogre and shook off the blood. It means I need to warn the capital and hope I'm not too late. An exhausted Archmage Samhael trudged back to his office to catch a few hours' sleep before he returned to the king's side. In all his years as a sorcerer, he'd never dealt with a lung infection as stubborn as King Adam's. No matter how many times he burned the illness away, it reappeared. If only the king was a warlord like his son, he could just heal the infection on his own. Samhael sighed. He might better wish for the moon to fall on the Northlands and kill the dragon while he was at it. The hall grew blurry, and his eyes watered. Just a little sleep. That would make all the difference. Fortunately, he only had a short walk from the king's chambers to the unused bedroom he'd appropriated for his temporary use. The unpredictable course of the illness demanded that he stay close to His Majesty at all times. Samhael pushed the door open and sighed. A rolled-up scroll lay on his desk, sealed and unopened. He choked back tears of exhaustion. Maybe it could wait. Surely 5 or 6 hours more or less wouldn't matter. He scrubbed a hand across his face and dropped into his chair. Sleep wouldn't come until he read the damn letter, so best to just do it. A flick of his thumb cracked the seal, and he unrolled the paper. He leapt out of his chair. Exhaustion burned away. Samhael raced out of his office and back down the hall. Dornkirk sat in front of the king's door. The king's champion sprang to his feet. "What is it?" "Trouble. General Cordwright has been killed by ogre assassins, and a small force has crossed the mountains. Their current location is unknown. I need to alert the king." Dornkirk shook his head. "He just fell asleep. He needs rest, not more problems." "I know that," Samhael said. "Better than anyone. But a new general needs to be appointed. We can't risk the Northern Army falling into chaos, not with winter so close." "So appoint someone. Cordwright must have had a deputy, someone he trusted as his second. Besides, it's Duke Iceborne's responsibility to appoint a general, not His Majesty's." Samhael stared for a moment. How had he forgotten that? The lack of sleep must have taken more of a toll than he thought. "Of course, I'll send the necessary messages. What about the prince? If there are ogres hunting in the kingdom, it's not a good time for a tour." Dornkirk pursed his lips, then nodded. "Call him back. They can't have gotten far anyway. I'll send some of my Crimson Legionnaires to collect him. If there's trouble, they'll handle it." Dornkirk settled back down and closed his eyes. "If there's anything else, let me know." "I will," Samhael said. The Archmage turned and shuffled back to his office. He was losing it. If the king appointed a general without Duke Iceborne's consent, it would lead to a major incident. With the king in such poor condition, they needed to avoid as much stress as possible. Though he'd often resented the taciturn champion, at times like this, Samhael appreciated Dornkirk's solid presence. The man gave off an unshakable feeling that steadied everyone around him. Either that, or he frightened them more than whatever threat they faced. Samhael grinned. He didn't fear much, but Dornkirk made the short list. It took 10 minutes to pen 2 brief letters, one to the Northern Army and the second to Duke Iceborne. That should settle things for the time being. Next, Samhael conjured a summoning sphere and sent it after Lydia. His second wouldn't have any trouble tracking down Andrew. The Bright Moon Inn stood 2 stories tall and was surrounded by a long stable on one side and a woodshed on the other. A raised porch ran the length of the front of the building and wrapped around out of sight. Beside the door hung a simple sign with a quarter moon carved into it. The place couldn't have been any more ordinary. Frederick took it all in at a glance. No archers waited behind the closed windows, and no movement drew his gaze to a potential attacker. It looked as safe as any unfamiliar building could be. He nodded once and led the way into the dirt yard. They were almost to the porch when a boy of perhaps 10 years and dressed in filthy clothes came running out of the stable. "Take your horses, sir?" the boy asked. "Yes, indeed." Andrew dismounted and slung his saddlebags over his shoulder. He reached into the pouch at his belt and tossed the boy a silver crown. "See that they're well taken care of." The stable boy made the coin disappear and bowed. "Count on me, sir." Andrew chuckled and made his way up the steps to the door. He reached for the handle, but Frederick stepped in front of him. "Best let me go in first." "For heaven's sake, Frederick, it's an inn, not a den of assassins." Andrew sighed when Frederick refused to move. Fine, have it your way. Frederick pushed the door open and stepped inside. His gaze raked the room, but nothing more threatening than a serving girl in a low-cut green and blue dress presented itself. The common room looked every bit as mundane as the outside of the building. If you plopped the inn down in any corner of the kingdom, it wouldn't have drawn a second look. Andrew stepped in beside him, eyed the girl, and grinned. Frederick immediately reevaluated the level of her threat and dismissed her again. The only danger here was to the prince's honor, not his life. "Can I show you to a table?" the girl asked. "You certainly can." Andrew fell in behind her, leaving Frederick and Helena to follow. Helena looked his way and rolled her eyes. Frederick finally smiled. If Andrew ended up with the serving girl, he'd have the evening with Helena, and that wouldn't be a bad thing. They settled into a corner table, and Andrew ordered a round of ale. At least Frederick didn't need to worry about the prince getting drunk. Any warlord worthy of the name could burn away the effect of excess alcohol in a second. "Her name's Robin." Andrew seemed unable to tear his gaze away from the girl. "Isn't that pretty?" "Heaven's mercy, you'd think you never saw a girl before," Helena said, speaking Frederick's thoughts out loud. Robin delivered their drinks, bobbed a curtsy, and returned to cleaning the common room. When she had gone, Andrew said, "It isn't that she's anything special. It's that I can't remember flirting with a girl who I know didn't want anything from me. It's a wonderful change of pace." Frederick grunted and took a sip of his ale, more to be polite than because he liked the taste of the stuff. As evening fell, the common room grew more and more crowded. Merchants and their guards coming or going to the capital mingled with farmers bringing late-season crops to market. The atmosphere was warm and agreeable, especially with the delightful aromas of roasting pork and apple pie wafting out of the kitchen. Frederick's mouth watered as he waited for their meal to arrive. 2 more serving girls joined Robin as the crowd grew, but she made certain no one else approached their table. It appeared Andrew would get his wish. The girl was clearly smitten. Hours later, their stomachs full and the other guests having all left for their beds, Andrew stood, straightened his tunic, and approached Robin. Helena smirked. "Think she'll go with him?" "She seems interested," Frederick said, his disinterest total. "How much do you think she'll charge?" Frederick shrugged. Despite the fact that they were supposed to be traveling as commoners, they had a hefty sum of gold and silver with them. Whatever the girl wanted, it wouldn't be a strain on their resources. "Maybe she'll tumble him for free." Helena barked a laugh and drained the last of her ale. "Not a chance, unless she recognizes him, which is doubtful. Only a tart sleeps with a man she barely knows, and never for free." That might be the strongest opinion he'd ever heard her voice. "You don't approve?" "That's irrelevant," she shook her head. There they go. Robin led Andrew upstairs by the hand. No coins were exchanged that Frederick saw, but maybe they handled the details in private. He had no experience with that sort of thing. "I knew a lot of working girls where I grew up." Helena blew out a sigh. "Hell, if I hadn't had a powerful soul force, I might have ended up one of them. It was nothing but pure luck that saved me from dying from some horrible disease, forgotten in a gutter." "I don't believe that," Frederick said. "Soul force or not, you're too strong a person to let that happen. If you hadn't ended up on the warlord's path, you would have found another way out. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Thanks. That means more to me than I can tell you." Helena leaned closer and he closed his eyes. Her breath felt warm on his lips. The inn shook and the door exploded. Frederick caught a hint of movement before the sword slammed through Helena's stomach. Karash and the rest of the Queen's Chosen approached the human city on foot, along with Acor and his squad. The sun had just set and the moon wasn't yet risen. With their superior night vision, the darkness would give the berserkers a huge advantage. Despite Sakar's assertions that they needed no advantage against a bunch of feeble humans, Karash intended to take no unnecessary chances. He would not fail his queen, nor would he let Sakar's arrogance doom the mission. The wall surrounding the city wouldn't prove an obstacle worth mentioning, but the guards patrolling it might sound the alarm. The real test would be bypassing the sorcerers flying through the sky above the city. If Karash and the others simply flew in, they'd be certain to notice. A little stealth would be necessary until the berserkers dispersed throughout the city.
"We're ready at your command, Karash,"
Acor said. Acor was a leader of great skill and wisdom. Karash would have preferred to have him instead of Sakar for the primary mission. Unfortunately, for all his skill, Acor lacked the raw power needed to assure the mission's success. That left him no choice but to accept the arrogant Sakar.
"Full speed to the base of the wall."
Karash glared at Sakar.
"Do not use the Queen's gift until we reach the palace. By then it will be too late for the sorcerers to react."
Sakar sneered.
"As you command, Karash." "Do not vex me, pup. I'm in no mood for it. Not now. Masks on."
Karash looked each berserker in the eye as they strapped on their dragon masks. They were ready.
"Go."
They reached top speed in 3 strides and arrived at the base of the wall seconds later. So far, so good. The humans didn't appear aware of their presence. Karash enhanced his hearing to its absolute limit. He listened until the guard passed and moved away.
"Up and over."
Karash gathered his power in his legs and leapt, clearing the wall easily and landing on the far side. Bones as hard as steel absorbed the impact with no trouble. Moments later, the others settled nearby. Karash looked up to gauge the sorcerer's reaction to their arrival. His eyes widened when 6 of them flew west at high speed. Truly, the Queen smiled on them. Their foes were now reduced in strength by almost half. Sakar grinned.
"Let's kill some humans."
The berserkers smashed through the door of the nearest building. Screams were soon silenced as they slaughtered the feeble occupants. These weren't warriors, just ordinary people. Killing them was as easy as breathing. The pathetic wretches didn't even try and fight back. They murdered the people in 2 more buildings before the first group of soldiers arrived. They weren't sorcerers or warlords, just more pathetic humans carrying weapons and wearing steel. Karash let a spear scrape across his chest, smiled at the human's reaction to his weapon failing to make a mark, and crushed the man's head with his fist. He hadn't even needed to use the sword strapped to his back. He glanced up. Still no sign of the patrolling sorcerers. Karash and his team couldn't continue with their part of the mission until the sorcerers were otherwise occupied. He'd just have to keep killing until they showed up. At this rate, he was more likely to get bored than injured. The thought had barely crossed his mind when a golden blast of energy streaked by him and exploded in the street. The force of the blast staggered him a step. Directly above them, 10 humans in red robes held glowing hands in their direction. Finally!
"Now!"
he shouted. Everyone ran in a different direction. Karash ran for the wall and circled close around it before turning toward the castle. At his maximum speed, the human sorcerers had no hope of keeping up. The moment he moved out of their sight, Karash suppressed his soul force and crouched down behind a stack of barrels outside a stone building. If they followed their orders, the rest of his team should be in hiding by now while Acor's team continued to raise hell. He counted to 200 before standing up and scanning the sky. No sorcerers. So far, so good. Once he found the others, they'd be in the clear. For a moment, Frederick stared at the blood gushing from Helena's stomach. Then the rage hit him. He didn't care where the ogres had come from or how they'd located their group. A rush of soul force flooded him. The berserker, these ogres could be nothing else, was still moving. The creature's blood-stained sword of frozen ice rose in slow motion as it prepared to finish Helena. A second ogre rushed toward Frederick. It carried an axe made of steel. Neither of them had any hope of striking home. At his maximum speed, he could run circles around even the fastest warlord. Frederick leapt out of his chair, drew his sword, and severed the wrist of the ogre attacking Helena. Its ice sword floated away. Blood oozed out like molasses. He reversed his stroke. The ogre's head drifted off in the opposite direction. Before it hit the end floor, he'd stabbed the second berserker through the heart. Frederick appeared at normal speed beside Helena. Behind him, the ogres collapsed to the floor. "Are you okay?" "Please say yes." He couldn't lose her now, not when they'd finally made a start on forging a real relationship. Helena nodded, her teeth clenched. "The wound's already healing. The sword missed my heart." She coughed and spat blood. "My lung wasn't so fortunate. I have enough power to complete my healing, but I'm not going to be much use in the fight." A crash and a scream came from upstairs. Andrew! He'd been so worried about Helena he'd forgotten his duty. Go. I'll be fine. Though his heart screamed not to leave her, Frederick knew his duty. He nodded once and accelerated to warlord speed. He raced up the stairs and turned left just in time to meet an ogre emerging from the wrong room, the blood of an unfortunate guest dripping from his axe. The ogre spotted Frederick and blocked a slash that should have severed his spine. Snarling, the ogre counterattacked. Blows rained down, powerful but clumsy, allowing Frederick to easily dodge. He didn't dare go to maximum speed. He'd used too much soul force in the initial clash. If he emptied his core, he'd have no chance against the berserkers. They exchanged half a dozen blows, neither gaining an edge. Another ogre emerged from a room further down the hall. It looked their way and grunted something in their savage language. Frederick's opponent snarled a response, prompting the second to turn toward Andrew's room. Depleted core or not, Frederick couldn't let the prince down. He drew deep, and his opponent seemed to slow. He dodged a heavy chop, spun, and drove his sword through the ogre's side up to the hilt. A twist and a yank freed Frederick's weapon. The ogre down the hall had smashed down Andrew's door and disappeared inside. Frederick closed the distance in an instant. He ran through the shattered door to find a naked Andrew and his opponent battling in slow motion. Robin lay dead on the floor, her head connected to her body by a thread of flesh. In the blink of an eye, the prince and his opponent returned to full speed. Frederick's dwindling soul force no longer allowed him to maintain his maximum acceleration. "Little help!" Andrew shouted as a powerful blow sent him sprawling across the bed. Frederick rushed to engage the ogre before it landed a finishing blow. Steel met ice as they traded rapid-fire strikes. Each blow sent vibrations up Frederick's arms. This ogre was much stronger than the others he'd faced. Either that or his rapidly draining soul force made it seem that way. Whatever the reason, he couldn't take his time with this one. Drawing the bulk of his remaining soul force, Frederick lunged with all his might. The berserker batted his blade aside with contemptuous ease. Frederick leapt back, avoiding the counterstroke by inches. How was he going to defeat this enemy? Behind him, Andrew scrambled up off the bed and raised his sword. Maybe together they'd have a chance. Maybe. The ogre bared its fangs and gave a rumbling laugh. It seemed their opponent didn't think any more of their chances than Frederick did. The laugh turned into a gurgle when the head of a spear burst from its chest. Never one to second-guess a good break, Frederick struck, taking the brute's head off. It collapsed, revealing a still bleeding Helena standing in the doorway. Andrew scrambled for his clothes while Frederick lunged across the room and caught her before she collapsed. "Excellent timing," he said as he lowered her to the floor. "Thanks. When the fighting dragged on, I knew you were having trouble. You used too much power downstairs." He hung his head. "Yeah, I may have lost my temper a bit. Andrew's okay, though, so things might have been worse." Doors were opening out in the hall and voices calling out. Frederick didn't bother enhancing his hearing enough to make out what they were saying. It didn't exactly take a genius to figure it out. Andrew, now fully dressed, took a knee beside them, his face drawn and ragged. "What the hell was that all about? How did those things find us?" "Your guess is as good as mine. We're certainly a long way from the border." Frederick shrugged. In truth, he hadn't the least idea how a squad of ogre berserkers had found them at a country inn hundreds of miles from the northern border. The only question that interested Frederick at the moment was, were there any more? "Prince Andrew!" someone shouted downstairs, a woman from the voice. Given the number of people that knew the prince was on his tour of the kingdom, it seemed unlikely a local would be calling for him. "Your Highness!" "I'll go shut whoever that is up," Andrew said. "You two come along when you're able. And thank you for saving my life." Andrew turned and left, saving Frederick from having to reply. He turned to Helena. Andrew didn't look too good. "No, this might be his first real brush with death." Helena flipped her hair out of her eyes with a bloody hand. "Before you say anything, the goblin pit doesn't count." Frederick looked back at Robin's body. I'm not sure it's his danger that bothered him. Seeing someone murdered right before your eyes can't be easy. No. Frederick took her hand and squeezed. When I feared that ogre had killed you, I lost my mind. I love you, Helena, and I'm sorry it took me so long to tell you. She managed to smile. I love you too. Now help me up. We need to find out what's going on. When Frederick and Helena reached the common room, they found Andrew in a heated discussion with a dark-haired woman in crimson robes. 5 others kept the curious and angry patrons a safe distance away. Frederick didn't know her or her companions, but he recognized the Archmage's Crimson Legion from his many visits to the capital. How had they known about the danger to the prince? Frederick, thank heaven, Andrew motioned them over. Please tell these people that the danger is past, and there's no reason to stop my tour before it even really begins. If the king sent the Crimson Legion to retrieve Andrew, he seriously doubted the danger had ended. The trick would be convincing Andrew. Frederick cocked his head. Is the danger past? The female sorcerer ground her teeth a moment and then let out a calming breath. As I was explaining to His Highness, we have reason to believe at least another 10 to 15 ogres crossed the mountains. Until they're dealt with, it would be best if all the royals were in one place to make protecting them easier. That's certainly a reasonable precaution, right, Andrew? Frederick asked. We wouldn't want any other innocents caught up in our fight. Andrew's angry expression softened a bit, and he whispered, No, we wouldn't. The kingdom's not going anywhere, Helena said. We can do the tour later. Andrew straightened and nodded. Right, let's saddle the horses. Actually, Highness, we'll be flying you back to the castle, the female sorcerer said. We'll send soldiers to retrieve your mounts. Andrew threw up his hands. Fine, whatever. He stormed out of the inn with a pair of sorcerers on his heels. The woman sighed. Thank you for helping convince him. I really didn't want to give an order to the crown prince. You must be Frederick St. Cloud. I hold your father in the highest regard. I'm Lydia Thorne, second in command of the Crimson Legion. They shook hands, and Frederick said, Unless she had a letter from his father, ordering Andrew wouldn't have worked anyway. In truth, if there are more potential assassins out there, I'll be just as happy to know he's somewhere safe. Those weren't ordinary warriors. They were easily as powerful as the strongest warlords I've ever fought. Yes, that was our information as well. Lydia leaned closer and whispered, They attacked the Northern Army and murdered General Cordwright. Helena gasped. Heaven's mercy! We'd best hurry before Andrew changes his mind. Frederick led the way out of the inn. His soul force had partially recovered, and he enhanced his senses to better detect any threats. The stars provided just enough light to reveal the empty yard. They'd barely taken a step out onto the deck when something came whistling through the air. Frederick scanned the sky and soon spotted another sorcerer approaching, this one in a blue and white uniform. Company coming, he said. I know. Power crackled around Lydia's hands. Where exactly? Northeast, in the air. Whoever it is, they're human and they're dressed in the uniform of the Northern Army. Lydia relaxed a fraction. What's happened now? We can't take many more surprises at this point. A bronze-skinned man, his black hair tied back in a tail, landed and bowed to the assembled group. Lan Shen, assigned to the Northern Army. I was on my way to report to the Archmage when I sensed your power. Is everything okay? For the moment. Lydia shook Lan's hand. Please tell me you don't have more bad news. No, I just wanted to give a detailed report about what I found when I investigated the ogres crossing the mountains. We're on our way back to the capital now, Lydia said. Why don't you fly with us? I'd like to know what we're dealing with as well. Frederick seconded that idea. He felt totally in the dark, and he didn't like it. Chapter 4. Assassins in the Capital. In the end, Karash's nose led him to the rest of his team. Nothing smelled quite like the mix of sweat and rage a berserker gives off during a fight, a sort of musky, spicy funk that any warrior knew at once. His squad gathered in an alley across from the outer castle wall. The castle guards stared out toward the flashes and explosions just as he'd hoped.
When do we attack?
Sakaar vibrated in place with barely suppressed energy.
Right now. As soon as the sorcerers made contact with the others, our time started counting down. Don't bother with the guards unless they get in your way. Push straight toward the keep. As long as we kill the king, nothing else matters.
He got immediate nods from Catan and Kolto. Sakaar tried to stare him down, but it would take more than a pup to balk Karash. At last, Sakaar growled and gave his nod.
Go!
Karash and the others rushed the wall at full speed. They leapt. As he passed, Sakaar tore the throat out of one of the guards. A cry went up, and soldiers came running out into the dark courtyard. Worthless idiots. If they'd just left the guards alone, the humans would have seen nothing but a passing blur. They may have even thought they imagined it. Now the whole cursed castle would be up and ready. If they lived through this, he was going to kill Sakaar himself. A phalanx of warriors quickly formed up in front of the doors to the keep. Spears bristled and shields locked together as more and more humans poured out of the nearby barracks. Many wore nothing but tunics and weapons. They had courage. Karash had to grant them that at least, not that it would save them. Sakaar and Kolto crashed into the gathered warriors a step ahead of Karash and Catan. Humans went flying in every direction. A sword skipped off Karash's arm without biting. In the blink of an eye, he tore the arm, swinging it out of the human's shoulder. Blood spurted, and the man fell screaming to the ground. The rustle of rushing footsteps mingled with the faint jingle of mail provided just warning enough for Karash to draw his stolen sword and spin to meet the chop of a human. The force of the blow drove him back a step.
Enemies behind!
Karash shouted. 9 more warriors accompanied the man that attacked him. Karash grinned. At last, some enemies worth killing. The human warlords were fast, almost as fast as Karash himself. 4 of them attacked at once. Even fighting in a fully defensive posture, the humans forced him to call on the Queen's gift to turn aside a portion of their strikes. 1 blow bounced off his side. The human gaped in surprise at his failed attack. Karash sliced his head off. Beside him, the others had finished off the humans, blocking their way, and turned back to engage the warlords. 4 against 9 wasn't especially fair, but Karash had no intention of giving the warlords a break. He didn't want to be out in the yard when the sorcerers returned. Catan's axe cut deep into the side of one of his opponents. That bought him just enough room to switch from defense to offense. Karash's sword darted in, punched through a warlord's armor, and sliced his heart in half. He ripped the blade free, spun, and hacked the head off the second warlord. Over the course of many battles he'd learned, against both humans and his own kind, that if you didn't instantly kill a berserker, they'd heal, and Karash preferred to only fight his opponents once. Silence surrounded him along with the bodies of his enemies. None of his team showed so much as a scratch. So far, so good.
Let's go.
Karash smashed through the closed doors and strode into the keep. He had a king to kill, and time grew short. The castle throne room was silent and nearly empty save for Dornkirk, the king, and 6 members of the royal guard who stood as silent as statues against the rear wall. Dornkirk rolled his massive shoulders, trying to work a crick out. It was a minor annoyance, but no matter how much soul force he sent to the area, it never stayed healed for more than a day or 2. Must be getting old. The king's champion looked down at his charge. King Adam sat on his throne, chin on fist, lost in thought. Despite his best efforts, he hadn't been able to convince the king to remain in bed. The archmage insisted he needed rest, but the king's worry about his son prevented him from calming enough to sleep. Dornkirk swallowed a sigh. Prince Andrew had gone on his tour of the kingdom, and not 3 days later they received word of ogres crossing the mountains. Not the most auspicious start to his journey. Dornkirk doubted the prince would be thrilled at the recall order, but until matters with the ogres were settled, it was best to be safe, especially given the king's frail condition. King Adam must have felt his gaze. He looked up, and Dornkirk tried to put on a reassuring expression. Of his many looks, reassuring came the least readily to him. The prince will be fine. Frederick will protect him. He'll be home safe and sound before morning. King Adam wheezed a laugh. The lung infection that had vexed him for the past 2 months had already begun to show itself after the most recent healing. If Dornkirk had believed in curses, he might have feared the king had fallen prey to one.
Am I so transparent?
The king asked. Only with regards to your son, Majesty.
Heaven's mercy, Dornkirk. Can you not even call me by my name when court is empty? You've been my champion for over a decade. If anyone's earned the right, it's you.
I don't want to get in the habit, lest I slip at an inopportune moment. He didn't add that no matter how long he served the king, he'd never be comfortable calling him by name.
And how fares young Frederick?
King Adam asked. He's... A tremendous crash, followed by the screech of steel on steel, saved him from having to answer. He was proud of all his son had accomplished, but didn't feel comfortable discussing it. I should check that, Dornkirk said.
One of those idiots probably knocked over a suit of armor. The night guards are nowhere near as competent as the day crew.
Dornkirk drew the demon sword and sent soul force surging through his body. That wasn't the crash of an empty suit of armor hitting the floor. It was the sound of combat. He'd covered half the distance to the door when it exploded inward. 4 figures rushed through the opening. Even with his enhanced vision, he barely made out more than an indistinct blur. He drew deeper from his core, and Lizen War sent extra power coursing through him. Dornkirk returned to the king's side in less than an eye blink. Even so, he barely blocked the descending blade before it struck the king. When their blades locked, he got his first good look at the intruder. It, for the creature was no man, stood over 8 feet in height, and muscles bulged all over its body under blue skin. It wielded a sword as long as Dornkirk was tall, and wore a white mask that looked like the face of a dragon. Ogre berserkers. Now they knew where the rest of the group that crossed the mountains ended up. The other 3 intruders were making fast work of the 6 royal guards, powerful warlords all. If these ogres could deal with them so easily, he was in serious trouble. Dornkirk registered all this, processed it, and made a decision in less than a heartbeat. The throne room was too open for a fight against 4 opponents as powerful as these. If he didn't have to defend the king, he might have made a different decision, but for now he had no choice but to run. A surge of soul force powered Dornkirk's swing, sending his opponent flying. He slung the king over his shoulder and ran at near warlord speed out the ruined door. The entire clash hadn't taken more than 2 seconds, and the king didn't speak so much as a word. King Adam had the good sense not to say anything now, either. The last thing Dornkirk needed was a distraction, not with the thunder of pursuing enemies filling his ears. The invaders gained with every step. Dornkirk didn't dare run at his maximum speed for fear of injuring the king. Unlike his son, King Adam wasn't a warlord. Dornkirk rounded a corner, and then another. Servants appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. He considered hiding in the city, trying to pick them off one at a time, but the assassins were too close to lose them. He knew what he had to do, even if he didn't like it. The Archmage had retreated to his basement workshop to try and figure out some way to help the king. Samhail had looked like hell after his last attempt to rid the king of his infection. Dornkirk didn't like relying on sorcerers, but he'd run out of options. Assuming he'd recovered, Samhail was one of, if not the most powerful sorcerer in the kingdom at the moment. A second later, they crashed through the door to the basement. They barely reached the bottom of the steps when Samhail appeared in the middle of the path. "What's happened?" the Archmage asked. "I sensed powerful, inhuman soul force." "Berserkers, 4 of them. Part of the group you mentioned, I suspect." Dornkirk set the king on his feet. "They're hard on our heels." "Never fear, Dornkirk." The Archmage favored him with a faint, condescending smile. "I sent one of my Crimson Guards to investigate. Things should be sorted momentarily."
"Thank heavens for that, Samhail," the king said. "We barely escaped those monsters the first time."
The Archmage bowed. "The Crimson Guard are ever at your Majesty's disposal." Dornkirk couldn't decide if he wanted to puke or punch Samhail in his smug face. Whatever he might think of the Archmage, at least the king was safe. Samhail cocked his head. "Let's make our way over to the escape tunnel, Majesty. Something very wrong is happening upstairs." "Merrick!" A short, slender man in red emerged from a door further down the hall. "Master?" "Enemies are coming. Deal with them." Merrick bowed. "Without fail, Master." The Archmage led the way toward the secret tunnel, his face scrunched up in a grimace. Samhail's concern twisted Dornkirk's stomach. Much as he disdained the sorcerer's arrogance, seeing his confidence rattled, at least in this situation, brought Dornkirk no pleasure. Karash snarled behind his mask when he regained his feet. The first humans they encountered were weak. Even the first batch of warlords had been nothing special. But this one was different. His power equaled, perhaps even surpassed, a member of the Queen's Chosen. A quick glance revealed that his comrades had finished the remaining humans.
After them!
Karash snapped. The 4 Queen's champions became like the Arctic wind as they pursued the fleeing human. Their prey had no hope of escaping. The human king's protector wasn't fast enough. "Must I handle this human for you, Karash?" Sakar asked. Karash would have gladly crushed Sakar's arrogant skull, but he feared he might need all the help he could get before this mission was complete. And they would complete it. The Queen's champions had never failed their mistress. The first time wouldn't be under Karash's command. Their prey turned down a flight of stairs from the sound of it. Why would he do that? Karash had assumed the human wished to flee. Perhaps he simply wanted to die on ground of his own choosing. Karash would be happy to oblige him. He rounded a corner and slammed face first into an invisible barrier, his mask pressed into the blue skin of his face. Beyond the barrier floated another human. This one wore red robes and carried no weapon. Sakar skidded to a stop beside the others.
A sorcerer. What a nuisance.
Karash's second slammed a massive fist into the invisible wall, drawing a dull thunk and nothing more. They would have to use the Queen's power. Karash focused, and an icy blue glow encased his fist.
Together,
he said. The rest of his team conjured identical glows, and as one they slammed their empowered fists into the wall. It shattered under the combined strike. The moment it did, Karash sped up and went for the sorcerer. His sword struck a solid blow, but the edge didn't bite. Karash roared and rained blows down on the enemy in red. Whatever protection held his sword back gave way, and the keen edge of his weapon hacked into soft flesh. The sorcerer fell in 2 pieces.
Come on!
Karash smelled the prey. It wouldn't be long now. The hunters reached a broken door with a set of steps leading down. The human had come this way, but he smelled someone else at the bottom. Karash paused and took a deep breath. It was the stink of another sorcerer.
If you so fear the humans, Karash, I will lead the way.
Sakar brushed past him and raced down the steps. Stupid whelp. Karash hadn't become leader of the Queen's Chosen because he ran blindly into the enemy's path. An energy blast shook the floor and sent Sakar reeling back into the stairs. Only the Queen's gift kept the fool from dying instantly.
Save him,
Karash said. It went against his better judgment, but he'd never abandoned a squad member, and he wasn't about to start now, even if it was the stupidest berserker in the army. Catan and Kolto rushed down the stairs, the energy gifted them by the Ice Queen glowing around their bodies. Karash followed at a slower pace. Often a swift attack might fail, but at the same time create an opening for a follow-up. The cold, musty tunnel led under the castle and out into the city. Dornkirk and Samhail kept the king between them as they hurried along by the glow of a conjured light. King Adam hacked and spat to one side. The damp wasn't doing his lungs any good. Dornkirk needed to get him somewhere safe and warm before the infection flared up too badly. At the front of the line, Samhail flinched. Dornkirk's enhanced senses revealed no threat, but sorcerers often knew things others didn't. "What is it?" Dornkirk asked. "My second legionnaire just died. What sort of berserkers can kill 2 sorcerers?" "That's an excellent question. I've fought the brutes twice in past incursions, but this bunch is far stronger than any I've ever encountered. For that matter, how did they sneak into the city in the first place?" The king fell to his knees as great, racking coughs shook him. Blood-flecked spittle flew from his mouth. Samhail sent a beam of energy into the king, and his breathing eased in moments. The glow surrounded him and lifted him off the ground. "We're almost to the end of the tunnel, Your Majesty," Samhail said. "We'll have you to safety in no time."
"I can walk,"
King Adam gasped between wheezes. "Please, Majesty, try and rest. The infection has badly weakened your body." Samhail tried to sound encouraging, but failed miserably. Far down the tunnel, the rapid thud of running boots reached Dornkirk. "They're coming." Samhail flew down the tunnel with the king beside him. Dornkirk easily kept pace. "I have 10 Crimson Legionnaires patrolling the skies above the city. Once we're clear of the tunnel, we'll have all the backup we need." "Collapse it," Dornkirk said. "That will buy us a few seconds." Golden blasts streaked past Dornkirk's head and slammed into the ceiling behind them. Broken rock tumbled from the ceiling. The rubble filled the passage from floor to ceiling. Dornkirk doubted the crude barrier would hold those berserkers long, but every second helped. The end of the tunnel appeared moments later. The 3 of them emerged from the basement of a run-down building half a mile from the castle and only 100 yards from the eastern gate. They scrambled up a set of rough steps and out into the snow-dusted streets. There were no people out on this frigid night, at least. Samhail sent a golden beam into the air where it exploded in a crimson blossom. 6 figures in red robes came flying towards the light. Samhail frowned, no doubt wondering where his other 4 men were, same as Dornkirk. "We'll have them now." The Archmage again failed miserably at sounding confident. "Forget that." Vibrations ran through Dornkirk's boots and he drew the demon sword. "Get the king to safety. There." The street exploded with 4 geysers of dirt and stone. When the debris fell away, the 4 berserkers remained in the air, each of them surrounded by an icy blue glow. Ogre sorcerers? Dornkirk had never heard of such a thing. "Stop them!" the Archmage shouted. The 6 sorcerers dove toward the ogres, golden blasts of soul force streaking from their hands. The enemy countered with blasts of their own, and the battle was joined. "Will you be okay?" Samhail asked. Dornkirk snorted, as if he needed a sorcerer worrying about him. "I'll be fine. Just go. Take His Majesty to the safe house." Samhail nodded and soared out toward the wall with the force field protecting the king in front of him. Good. The Archmage would escort the king to safety. Once the protections were activated, nothing short of an angry dragon would be able to breach the walls of that fortress. King and Archmage were halfway to the wall when one of the berserkers broke away from the others and streaked toward them. A pale blue beam of energy struck Samhail. The Archmage went spinning out of control. The protective barrier around King Adam vanished, sending him plummeting toward the ground. Dornkirk drew deep from his core and accelerated to warlord speed. In the blink of an eye, he covered the distance separating him from the king. Dornkirk leapt and snagged the flailing king out of the air. They landed hard, but Dornkirk's enhanced body absorbed the impact with no damage. "Are you well, Majesty?" "As well as can be expected under the circumstances. What happens now?" Dornkirk watched the battle in the sky and wished he had a good answer for his king. "Let's find somewhere to hole up. Samhail and his sorcerers can handle the ogres." "You don't sound very optimistic." The king started back toward the building they'd exited. It didn't strike Dornkirk as a very good place to hide, but at the moment he couldn't come up with a better idea. That he should be reduced to fleeing a quartet of grubby ogres turned Dornkirk's stomach. He'd killed scores of the brutes over the years, but none like this group. If he hadn't seen them with his own eyes, he would have doubted such creatures existed. As they made their way at the king's labored pace, he kept glancing skyward. On his third look, a berserker rammed his fist through the chest of one of the sorcerers. Dornkirk would have had trouble doing that with the demon sword, much less his bare hand. His grip tightened on Lizenwar. Whatever it took to keep the king safe, he'd do it. The body of a second sorcerer thudded to earth a little ways away. Dornkirk's jaw clenched. Whatever it took. Lon hadn't spent much time in the capital, despite the fact that his grandfather's dojo was there. He certainly hadn't expected his first visit in a year to be instigated by the near murder of the crown prince. Below the small group, the Great Green whizzed by. Lydia had decided to take a straight line back to the castle, and that path sent them flying over the edge of the giant forest. He darted a glance at the 3 figures suspended in a bubble under the Crimson Legionnaire commander. The prince wasn't what Lon had expected. He seemed far younger than his 17 years. Lydia stopped, and a moment later Lon sensed it. Sorcerers fought a battle up ahead, and the only place with sorcerers around here was the capital. Well, now he knew where the last of the ogres went. "What's the holdup?" Prince Andrew asked, his voice muffled by the bubble. The bubble transformed into a platform, and Lydia landed on it. "There's a battle going on in the city. We can't bring you there." The prince squinted toward the capital, but Lon doubted even a warlord could see anything from this distance. "If there's a battle, I should go to my father." Lydia shook her head. "No, Highness. Our orders were to keep you safe, and flying into a battle is the exact opposite of safe." Prince Andrew glared at Lydia, drawing a wince from Lon. "Are you really going to ignore my order?" "If I obey your order, I'll be disobeying your father's. I would very much appreciate it if you didn't put me in the position of choosing between my king and my prince." Lon almost heard the prince's teeth grinding. Frederick put a hand on Prince Andrew's shoulder. Unlike the prince, Frederick seemed older than his years. "You know your duty," Frederick said. "If your father's in danger, you must be kept safe. The line of succession must be maintained. Should, heaven forbid, something happen to both you and the king, there will be chaos as the dukes fight over the throne." Lon's eyes widened as he finally understood. He flew closer. "That was the Ice Queen's plan all along. By killing the general of the Northern Army and creating chaos in the capital, she'd make an opening her army could march through virtually unopposed." "We'll go to the royal safe house," Lydia said. "It's secure and defensible. I'm certain the Archmage will do everything he can to get the king there as well." "Fine. I'll go," Prince Andrew said. Frederick gave the prince's shoulder a final squeeze. "Thank you. Don't worry, I'll check on our fathers." "You're leaving me alone?" The panic in the prince's voice would have been comical under different circumstances. "Hardly. You have Helena and the sorcerers to protect you. There's nothing I can do that they can't, and I might be of some use in the capital." "I don't dare spare anyone to fly you there," Lydia said. "I'll do it," Lon offered. "I owe these monsters for killing my commander." Lydia nodded. "Good luck." The stunningly attractive female warlord, Helena, grabbed Frederick by the tunic and yanked him close. "Don't you dare get yourself killed." Frederick's stoic expression finally cracked. He smiled and stroked her cheek. "I'd never do anything so foolish now that I have so much to live for." Frederick broke away and hopped off the platform. Lon caught him in a soul force bubble of his own, and they flew toward the capital while the others turned south. Lon didn't actually know where the safe house was. He suspected not many people did. "Can you give me some idea what we're flying into?" Frederick asked. "Multiple sorcerers fighting. Beyond that, I can't tell." The city appeared seconds later. Lines of energy streaked through the air, some gold and some blue. He expected the gold, but blue? That didn't make any sense. Lon slowed his approach. They didn't need one of their allies blasting them by mistake. When they reached the outer wall, he stopped and hovered. The battle consisted of two distinct groups. A smaller group near the edge of the city fired blasts at the ground, while a larger group fought ogres flying through the air. "I didn't think ogres had sorcerers," Frederick said. "Me neither, but I'd begun to suspect the possibility when this lot flew over the mountains. It seemed like too minor a task for one of the dragons to do it." "Lower me to the street," Frederick said. "Those berserkers are too fast for sorcerers to hit. I'll be of more use cleaning them up." He said it like killing berserkers was a simple thing for him. And maybe it was. Lon didn't have much experience fighting with warlords, though judging by how the ones assigned to the Northern Army had fared, maybe Frederick shouldn't be so confident. Lon set the bubble on the street, then dissolved it. "Good." Frederick had already disappeared. "Luck." He turned toward the battle in the sky. Every soul force he sensed overmatched his by a lot. Maybe he should simply stay out of the way. The thought had barely crossed his mind when one of the Crimson Legionnaires went down. Damn it! Maybe he wasn't the strongest, but he had to try and help. Lon watched the swirling battle above the capital. The three ogres powered through the sky surrounded by pale blue auras, while the golden forms of the sorcerers pursued them. They traded explosive spheres and focused lances of energy. Neither side seemed able to gain an advantage. He shivered as he saw and, more importantly, felt the power of both sides' attacks. How could he make a difference and not get in the way, or worse, get himself killed? Just rushing in wouldn't accomplish anything. After a few seconds, the ogre's pattern became clear to him. They flew in wide, swooping figure eights. The Crimson Legionnaires were so focused on their individual targets they must not have noticed. Lon drew from his core. If he disrupted the pattern, it might create an opening. He conjured a golden wall directly in front of a female ogre. The monster swerved to avoid it. In its moment of distraction, 2 sorcerers blasted it from opposite directions. It resisted for a second, then the blue aura shattered and it exploded in a shower of gore. Lon thrust a fist in the sky. So far, so good. Now that he knew how to make a difference, his confidence swelled. At least it did for the half a second it took to notice one of the other ogres flying straight at him. The instant Frederick's feet hit the ground, he accelerated to warlord speed and raced toward where the sorcerers fought in vain to hit the berserkers. He could handle warriors on the ground with swords, and the faster he handled it, the sooner the sorcerers would be free to go help their fellows. Most of his corps had refilled since the battle at the inn, so Frederick had no hesitation about entering the fight. Houses appeared and disappeared as he ran. He caught the occasional glimpse of a frightened face peeking out a window, but he didn't waste time trying to reassure them. The best thing Frederick could do for the people of the capital was kill the ogres that had invaded as quickly as possible. He rounded a bend and found himself face to chest with an ogre. The masked monster seemed every bit as startled as Frederick. Lucky for him, Frederick recovered first and rammed his sword through the berserker's chest. He jerked his weapon free, spun, and hacked his opponent's head off just to be sure. 1 down. He paused a moment before racing ahead. Golden lances of energy streaked down into the streets, blowing holes in the stone and sending gravel into the air. The targets were hidden behind buildings that shook from the blast's impacts. Considering how fast the berserkers moved, he doubted the sorcerers even saw them. They had to be aiming at where they sensed the enemy's soul forces. If he ran into that mess, an errant blast would be as likely to kill him as an ogre. Frederick gathered himself and leapt onto a nearby roof. One of the sorcerers must have sensed his arrival as she turned his way. He waved her over, and to his surprise, she stopped shooting and descended. Maybe she figured since she couldn't hit anything anyway, she might as well hear him out. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "It's dangerous." "I noticed. If you and your companions would stop blasting, I'd be happy to kill those ogres for you." Under other circumstances, her look of disbelief would have annoyed him. "You think you can handle them better than us?" "At least I can see them," he said. "How many have you killed so far?" She looked away. "None." "Then I'm 1 up on you." He jerked a thumb over his shoulder. She looked where he indicated, and her eyes went wide. "I think these things are just trying to keep you busy while their friends kill your friends across the city." "I sensed the battle." She chewed her lip a moment. "Are you certain you can kill them?" Frederick nodded. "As certain as I can be. In battle, there are no guarantees." "Fair enough. You got a name?" "Frederick St. Cloud." Her jaw dropped just a little. "Dornkirk's son? Why didn't you say so in the first place? We'll leave you to it. Good luck." She flew over to collect her people. The instant the blast stopped, he raced toward the nearest ogre. They'd split up to make it harder for the sorcerers to hit more than one at a time, and he wanted to take advantage of that. It wouldn't take them long to regroup, so he had to hurry. He found the first one more by smell than sight. The blue-skinned brutes gave off a distinct funk. The female ogre stared up at the sky, probably wondering why the sorcerer had stopped blasting. Frederick rushed in. The ogre detected him. Her club dropped in time to deflect his sword. At Warlord's speed, the blows came 10 to the heartbeat. His opponent was strong and fast. Clearly, the Ice Queen had chosen her best warriors for this mission. Killing them all would be a potent blow to her army. He barely ducked a swipe that would have sent his head flying over the city wall had it connected. The force of the swing put the female just a hair off balance. That provided all the opening he needed. Before she recovered, he darted in and slashed the ogre's throat. Her racing heart sent a fountain of blood spurting several feet into the air. Frederick raised his sword to finish his opponent. The thunder of approaching boots warned him just in time to spin and deflect the chop of a steel axe. A male ogre a foot taller than the female he'd just defeated rained a barrage of blows down on Frederick. They fell with such force a breeze blew across his face. Not even bothering to try and block, he danced around the whistling steel. Compared to the female, this berserker moved in slow motion. Eventually, the monster would make a mistake. When it did, he'd strike. Or at least that was the plan. Another set of steps approached from his left. Frederick grimaced. If he got caught between two berserkers, even his speed advantage might not be enough. He had 2 seconds at most to finish off this enemy before his reinforcements arrived. There was no help for it. Frederick drew deep from his core and accelerated to lightning speed. His opponent seemed to freeze in place. Frederick's sword slammed through the ogre's chest, slicing its heart in half. The moment he released lightning speed, the male berserker collapsed. Frederick had just time to set himself before the next opponent appeared. The burst of speed had cost him a quarter of his soul force, but he'd begun to get a handle on how to use the technique. Maintaining it for an entire battle wasn't the way to go. Better to use it in a quick, killing strike before releasing it again. With this new insight, Frederick faced the approaching ogre, confident that he'd have no trouble winning. His legs went out from under him when the female's arm crashed into the back of his knees. How did she survive getting her throat cut that deep? He'd nearly cut her head off. In the blink of an eye, a male armed with a huge club made of ice loomed over him. Frederick rolled under the first blow, spun away from the second, somehow scrambled under the berserker's legs and to his feet. He didn't dare take any more chances. Even if it drained his soul force, he needed to end this before any more surprises arrived. At lightning speed, he decapitated both ogres. Frederick fell to his knees, gasping for air. Only a third of his soul force remained in his core. He listened, but heard nothing beyond the pounding of his heart. It seemed he was safe for the moment. Lon raced through the sky with a pair of angry ogres on his tail, the only two left in the sky. He didn't bother to attack. Anything he could conjure wouldn't so much as dent their shields. Instead, he wove as random a path through the air as possible. Blue streaks screamed past him. One came so close it singed his skin even through his soul force barrier. This would teach him to stick his nose into a fight between forces beyond his grasp. A blast detonated to his right, sending him tumbling through the air. He righted himself, just in time to find a fist the size of a ham racing in toward his face. Lon released his power and fell. The breeze from the near miss ruffled his hair. Just above the rooftops, he caught himself and flew a looping path back into the sky. When no further attacks shot his way, Lon spun and surveyed the sky. The other sorcerers had engaged the ogres, happily returning him to observer status. Having barely survived his last attempt to help out, he hesitated to interfere again. On the other hand, his surprise attack had allowed them to kill one of the enemies, so maybe he needed to risk it. The less scarred monster raised its hands. An instant before Lon sensed its attack was ready to be unleashed, he conjured golden spheres around the ogre's hands. Its gathered power detonated, reducing its hands to a red mist. The ogre loosed an agonized howl. 3 sorcerers surrounded it and concentrated their attacks. The resulting explosion rained pieces of ogre down over the city. With only a single ogre left, the Legion concentrated their attacks. The brute made it a job, but in less than a minute, all the aerial threats had been eliminated. Lon blew out a breath. Sometimes he wasn't sure he was cut out to be a fighter. Hopefully Frederick was having a better time of things. When the human king fell from the sky, Karash hoped for a moment that he'd completed his mission, but the warlord he'd crossed swords with earlier caught the falling king and ran for safety. Pity. But then killing a king, even a feeble human one, shouldn't be an easy task. The greater the effort, the greater the glory when the mission was complete. Behind his mask, Karash bared his fangs. He would enjoy crossing swords with the human again. He prepared to dive after his prey. A beam of energy struck him in the chest and sent him sailing out of control. A second and third blast crashed into his energy barrier. The potent strikes drained his power quickly. During the battle, he'd noticed the Queen's gift didn't regenerate as fast as it did at the tower. Perhaps the distance between Karash and his mistress caused the problem, or maybe it was something else. Either way, he had only limited time and strength to complete his mission. Karash dove and spun, evading the next shot and locating the human attacking him. It was the one that tried to escape with Karash's prey. Golden energy crackled around the human and gathered near his hands. Perhaps this sorcerer was stronger than he'd first thought. Good. Karash loved a worthy fight. He mirrored his opponent, icy blue energy glittering around his clenched fists. Roaring and letting his rage power his attack, Karash sped toward the human. Lances of blue energy streaked toward his target. The sorcerer cartwheeled out of the way and countered with a blast of his own. Once again, Karash found himself floundering across the sky as the blast knocked him out of control. It didn't take a genius to realize his foe had more experience at fighting in the air than Karash, and, worse, he had the power to make use of that knowledge. Karash needed to stop thinking like a sorcerer and start thinking like a berserker. Otherwise, the human would wear him down and he'd fail in his task. That wasn't going to happen. The innate power of a berserker surged through him, enhancing his perception and making it appear that his opponent had slowed. The human's hands raised for another blast. Karash raced in at full speed. Before the enemy could react, he struck the man in the face with a heavy fist. The sorcerer went tumbling away. Not wanting to risk his foe's recovery and counterattack, Karash sped after him, this time delivering a crushing double-fisted blow to the human's back. His opponent crashed to the street below. Dust and snow billowed up at the impact. Karash drew on the Queen's power again, sending twin spheres into the debris. They detonated together, blowing away the cloud and revealing the broken human lying in the dirt, bleeding but alive. Karash panted and landed beside his vanquished enemy. The Queen's power had dimmed to little more than a spark in his chest. That had been far too close. The sorcerer raised his hand as Karash stalked in for the kill, but no energy gathered. He was drained. Karash had only to administer the final blow and hunt down the king. He drew his sword and looked down at the bleeding, barely conscious human. This man was a worthy opponent, deserving of the honor of dying by the sword.
Do you have a name?
Karash removed his mask, letting the human see the face of his death. The sorcerer spit blood.
Samhael. I will remember it. You were a strong foe.
Samhael's lips cracked in a smile. I doubt that. Did this human question his honor? Only his enhanced senses saved him. Karash just managed to whip his sword around to block the strike of the warlord he'd fought earlier. The force of it sent Karash flying back. He slammed into a building hard enough to smash through the wall. He stared up into the dark ceiling and snarled. A cowardly attack, but he couldn't deny its power. He'd taken blows from berserkers that didn't hit that hard. Karash crunched to his feet, ignoring the cowering humans staring at him from the top of the nearby stairs. He accelerated to his maximum speed. Karash had barely put a foot outside the building when the warlord reached him. The slender steel blade danced through the air. It took all Karash's skill to keep from getting run through. A slow grin spread across Karash's face. This was how he was meant to fight. Toe to toe and blade to blade, not flying around like some bird. The human's face showed only grim determination as he stabbed over and over, high, low, left, right, never in the same place twice or at the same angle. It was a masterful display. Even on the receiving end of it, Karash couldn't help but marvel at the warlord's skill. Lucky for the Queen, all the humans didn't fight like this. Her armies wouldn't stand a chance. The barrage seemed to last forever. Karash fought purely on the defensive. Twice he came close to getting disemboweled. Only a lucky twist of his sword saved him. His hope that the human would run out of strength faded by the second. If anything, Karash felt his own berserker power running low. The Queen's power had grown from a spark to a flame. There was no honor in it, but if he wanted to complete his mission, he had no choice. Karash drew soul force into his mouth and finally offered a high slash. As expected, the warlord blocked. Karash locked their blades and spat blue fire into the human's face. His opponent staggered. Karash lashed out. The warlord's head fell to the street with a wet plop. Karash sagged, utterly exhausted. He should let his strength recover, but there wasn't time. He needed to finish the king before more defenders appeared. Frederick left the last ogre in a bleeding heap on the ground and ran for all he was worth towards the ongoing battle. In the skies above, 2 ogres battled 6 sorcerers. He didn't know much about the sorcerers' duels, but somehow it appeared the badly outnumbered ogres were holding their own. For better or worse, that fight was out of his hands. It wasn't like he could fly, after all. His father had to be somewhere around here. Frederick needed to find him. The coppery tang of fresh blood drew him a little off his intended path. He skidded to a halt in front of a shallow crater. A body dressed in a crimson robe lay in the center of the depression. One of the sorcerers must have gotten hit pretty hard to make a hole like that. A little ways away, he spotted a decapitated body in a warlord's uniform off to one side. A gasp escaped his lips when he saw the sword lying beside it. Heaven's mercy. He recognized Lizenwar, the demon's sword. That meant the body. Who did this to you? Not that he expected his father to answer. There were no threats in the area, at least on the ground. It was an ogre. Frederick sprang to his feet and spun a fast circle, sword raised. He found nothing but darkness and the distant sound of battle. Down here. The voice was more in his mind than his ears, but somehow he knew it came from the sword. He crouched in front of the demon's sword. Father said the spirit of the blade hadn't spoken to him since she agreed to accept him as her bearer. He preferred it that way, though Frederick assumed if necessary the spirit would have told his father whatever he needed to know. Lizenwar? What happened? Dornkirk met his match. I've never encountered a berserker as powerful as the one your father battled. It used internal as well as external soul force. Your father gave it his all, but in the end he lacked the strength to prevail. Frederick tried to imagine an enemy so powerful his invincible father couldn't handle it and failed. In all his years, he never even knew his father to be challenged by an enemy, much less overwhelmed. How can an ogre use sorcerer abilities? My guess is that power was transferred to it by the dragon, much as a warlock gains power from a demonic patron. I suspect these ogre sorcerers gained their new talents from their mistress. But you don't know for sure. If the dragon could give that sort of power to her servants, why haven't we encountered one before? Frederick stood up and shook his head. Doesn't matter. I'm going to find this monster and kill him. I will help you. I can do it myself. I owe it to my father. In your depleted state, all you'll accomplish is your own death. Your potential is greater than Dornkirk's. It would be a shame to waste it in a futile fight. How can you help? I can restore your soul force and reinforce it with my own power. Frederick ground his teeth. You held back some of your strength during the fight? That might have been the difference between him living and dying. Any given human can only contain so much demonic soul force. He almost heard her sigh. Had I given Dornkirk any more than I did, it would have killed him as surely as the ogre's sword. Contrary to what everyone seems to think, I can't solve every problem my bearer encounters. I'm a demonic spirit, not a god. Frederick hesitated. The demon's sword wasn't likely to lie to him, and it was right about his condition. He used too much power between here and the N. If Frederick encountered even a regular berserker, he doubted he'd defeat it in his current circumstances. Very well. We'll avenge him together. Frederick bent down and scooped up the blade. Power rushed into him. His core refilled and overflowed, infusing soul force into his body. The aches and stiffness from his earlier encounters vanished. All his senses sharpened to a degree he'd never experienced before. A ways down the street, a guttural voice said,
At last I have you. Time to die, human king.
The king! Frederick accelerated to lightning speed and closed the distance between him and the voice in a heartbeat. An ogre armed with a steel sword stood over King Adam in the ruins of a dilapidated house. The sword went up. Frederick swung Lizenwar with all his might. Somehow the ogre sensed him coming. Its weapon lowered and intercepted the strike. The force of the impact sent the monster flying. Frederick stopped to check on the king. Are you okay, Majesty? King Adam managed to nod between coughs. Andrew? He's fine. Helena and the Crimson Legion took him to the safe house. The king smiled with blood-flecked lips. Thank you. I'm sorry about your father. Frederick shook his head. Don't be. He died in battle protecting his king. Father wouldn't have wanted it any other way. The ogre climbed to its feet, seeming no worse for the impact. Excuse me, Your Majesty. Frederick bowed and channeled more soul force. Is this the one? Yes, he killed Dornkirk. The ogre rested its massive sword on its shoulder.
Run along, pup. No need for you to die today.
I don't think so. You took my father's head. I'm here for yours. For just a moment, the ogre looked tired beyond words. Then it attacked. Frederick met it at lightning speed. Even at his maximum acceleration, the ogre kept up. It was a little sluggish, but a shining aura deflected the 2 glancing strikes he landed. Frederick blocked a counterstrike that struck with such force his hands vibrated even with all his enhancements. He understood now why his father lost to this enemy. It took everything he had to stay even with the monster. It had to be exhausted from previous battles. Of course, Frederick wasn't all that fresh. The exchange of steel on steel sounded like a mad blacksmith. Frederick used every trick he'd learned at the Citadel, plus everything his father had taught him. The berserker deflected every blow and made counters more often than Frederick would have thought possible. He needed to think more creatively. Helena used a trick once when they fought, and it almost got him. It might work even though he used a sword instead of a spear. Frederick retreated a step, loaded all his weight on his back leg, and lunged toward the ogre. His whole body left the ground and raced toward his opponent's chest like a spear with the demon sword as its tip. The ogre had moved to pursue, and its momentum was all wrong to dodge, yet somehow it spun just enough that instead of punching through its chest, the demon sword slid along its ribs. The blue aura collapsed, and blood flew. Frederick hit the ground and rolled back to his feet. With its protective barrier down, this was his only chance. He rushed back into the fray on full offense. Lisenmore snapped out, narrowly missing the ogre's throat. When the counterstrike came, Frederick let it hit his ribs. 2 of them broke, but his iron skin held. He trapped the ogre's sword between his side and arm and twisted, yanking it from the ogre's grip. Spinning a full circle, Frederick sliced the ogre's head in half at the nose. The dead monster slumped to the cobblestones. He very much wanted to join it, but didn't dare leave the king alone. He sent soul force into his side to numb the pain and repair his crushed ribs. As exhilarating as the battle had been, he really hoped he never had to fight an opponent that strong again.
You did well. Your father would have been proud. I would be happy to have you as my new bearer.
I can't think about that now. It's too much, too soon. King Adam had pulled himself out of the run-down house. His robes were plastered to his back with sweat and stained with spots of the blood he'd coughed up, but at least he was still breathing. Lon and 4 crimson legionnaires landed nearby. They all bowed to the king, who waved them off.
I need to lie down, the king said.
Of course, your majesty, one of the sorcerers approached. I'll take you to your chamber. Is the castle secure? Frederick asked.
We've defeated all the ogres, the sorcerer said.
You're certain? Frederick asked. The castle's been searched?
No, but I'm sure we would have sensed them if any of the monsters remained. Do you have a better suggestion?
Frederick didn't care for the sorcerer's tone, but he let it go. Why don't we go to the safe house until the city has been fully secured? Prince Andrew is waiting there anyway.
Yes, the king let out a loud wheeze. Take me to my son.
As you command, your majesty. The sorcerer shot Frederick an angry glare before wrapping the king in a soul force bubble. I'll begin sweeping the castle, Frederick said. I still have most of my strength. Lon moved to stand beside him. I'll help. Frederick nodded his thanks, and the 2 men strode off toward the castle while the king and his protectors flew off. Andrew would be pleased to see his father, but given King Adam's condition, he wasn't sure how much longer they'd have. Chapter 5. No Time to Celebrate. The royal safe house wasn't designed for luxury, but it had a few creature comforts as befit its status as a retreat for royals. The small, windowless study held an iron stove that burned with a pleasant fire, 2 leather chairs newly dusted, and a selection of leather-bound books in a case against the back wall. Compared to his room at the Citadel, it was a palace. Andrew didn't have patience enough to enjoy the soft chairs or selection of wine. Instead, he paced. 5 steps. Turn. 5 steps. Turn. At least there wasn't a rug to wear out. The cold stone floor bore his endless strides with total indifference. Could you possibly stop that for 5 minutes? Helena leaned against the wall beside the door, spear in hand. The bloody gash in her chest had fully healed, though she'd be needing a new uniform soon. I need to do something or I'll go mad. His father was in danger, and his best friend was out fighting to protect him. He should be out there too. It was impossible, of course. Andrew accepted that, as the future king, he needed to remain secure in case the worst should happen. He had responsibilities beyond his own desires. For a moment, he stopped his pacing as the serving girl from the Bright Moon Inn appeared in his mind's eye. If he'd just restrained himself, she might still be alive. He resumed his march. All these horrible images flashed through my mind over and over again. For all I know, I may be king. Frederick might be dead and the capital in flames. I feel completely useless stuck in this gopher hole. I'm worried too, but if there's one certain thing, it's that we should never underestimate Frederick. He'll survive and rescue your father. I have to believe that or go as batty as you. Andrew paused and grinned. You make an excellent point, though that's hardly a polite way to address your future king. She favored him with a rude gesture, which finally drew a laugh. He sucked in a breath to retort when she held up a hand. Someone's coming. Lydia? Probably. I haven't heard sounds of battle. Her grip tightened on her spear. The door opened, revealing Lydia's crimson-draped figure. Helena relaxed and stepped aside. The sorcerer bowed and said, The surviving members of the Legion have returned with your father. He's alive and uninjured, though the stress has exacerbated his lung condition. I'm on my way to check on him, and I thought you'd like to join me. It felt like someone had lifted a 1,000-pound weight off Andrew's chest. I would like that. Thank you. He and Helena fell in behind Lydia, and they strode down the stone tunnels that served as halls. The safe house had been carved out of a granite deposit by sorcerers centuries ago as a hold of last resort. Andrew wasn't certain it had been used before today. Is Frederick okay? Helena asked, the concern clear in her voice despite her best effort to hide it. He was, though Dornkirk fell in battle along with Archmage Samhail. Frederick took up his father's sword and killed the leader of the enemy force in single combat, saving the king in the process. Helena shot a look at Andrew and mouthed, Told you. He smiled but didn't comment. The king's champion and the Archmage killed on the same day. That was every bit as unprecedented as using the royal safe house. It had been a day of firsts, and none of them good. The redoubt wasn't that big, so it didn't take long to make the trip to the bedroom where they'd brought his father. 2 Crimson Legion sorcerers stood on either side of the door. Lydia opened it and gestured for Andrew to go in first. His father lay under a heavy blanket, only his pale face and trembling hands visible. When their eyes met, Father's grim expression lightened. He held out his hand, and Andrew went over and sat beside him on the edge of the bed.
I feared for you, my son.
Likewise, I'm relieved to find you well. Father coughed, loud and rasping.
Perhaps well is over-generous, but alive at least, which is more than I can say for many others.
Lydia told me. I'm sorry about Dornkirk. I know you were friends. His father let out a gurgling chuckle.
I'm not sure Dornkirk had any true friends. His son is a remarkable young man. He wielded the demon sword every bit as well as his father.
He's something, all right. Racking coughs shook the king. Lydia hurried over, her hands glowing with healing energy. Excuse me, Your Highness. Andrew took the hint and moved out of her way. A golden glow soon enveloped his father. 5 minutes later, he was breathing easy.
Thank you, young lady, he said. I don't believe we've been introduced.
Lydia Thorne. I served as Samhail's second-in-command. The king nodded.
I'm hereby appointing you Archmage Pro Tem. You'll serve until the High Sorcerers can meet and select their preferred replacement.
Lydia bowed. I'm honored, Your Majesty.
Leave me now. I'd like to sleep.
Sleep well, Father. Andrew led them back into the hall. Would you walk with me? Lydia asked. Andrew nodded. When Helena made a move to follow, Lydia raised her hand. We'll need a minute or two alone. She bristled and looked at him. It'll be okay. Why don't you head back to the lounge? I'll be along in a little while. Helena stalked off, drawing a sigh from Andrew. A bit hot-tempered, Lydia said as she started down the hall away from the listening sorcerers. You could say that? Andrew fell in beside the acting archmage. She's mostly worried about Frederick. What did you have to tell me? It's your father.
Samhail misread the damage in his lungs as an infection. It's actually a degenerative flaw. No matter how many times I heal it, the repair won't last. Andrew stopped, heart hammering in his chest. What exactly are you saying? The king is going to die. With treatment, he might last another 6 months. Without, weeks at most. I'm so sorry. Andrew couldn't believe it. It felt like a dream, a nightmare. When the hall stopped spinning, he asked, Does he know? I didn't think it was my place to say anything. Do you wish me to tell him? No. No, I'll take care of it. Andrew had no idea how he'd take care of it, but that was a problem for later. Frederick crept down the empty hall, wincing at every clumsy step his companion took. He didn't think badly about the sorcerer. Lon had proven an adequate companion, but after an hour of searching, he'd decided no other ogres remained and he didn't need to sneak anymore. Frederick was inclined to agree with him, but that didn't matter. Until they'd checked the entire castle from top to bottom, he'd assume the potential for danger remained and behave accordingly. Why do you suppose the Ice Queen sent assassins after all this time? Lon asked in an overly loud voice. I mean, the kingdom has basically been at war with the dragons since our ancestors first arrived from the old empire. I have no idea. Looking into the mind of a dragon wasn't something they taught us at the Citadel. Please keep your voice down. There may be more enemies about. Nah, if there were any ogres in the castle, they'd have attacked by now. 2 humans on their own would make too tempting of a target. I know we have to clear the place to make sure, but I'm confident the crisis is over. He's probably right. Do you want to risk the king's and Andrew's life on probably? Frederick asked in response to the demon sword's silent statement. Okay, Lon said, obviously thinking Frederick had been speaking to him. I said we have to clear the castle to be sure. They left the hall and entered the throne room. The bodies of slain royal guards lay behind the throne. Broken benches had been scattered around in the battle. It must have been quite a fight. What a mess, Lon said. There was a statement Frederick couldn't argue with. Let's clear the 2nd floor, then we'll be good. I'm right behind you. Frederick led the way to the stairs, brushed aside the remains of a shattered door, and climbed. Even with his enhanced sight, it was dim. As if reading his mind, Lon conjured a light. Frederick's gaze was drawn to a faint glow coming from under one of the doors up ahead. Do you see that? What? The light. Lon's glowing globe vanished, plunging them into darkness. The glow ahead of them seemed brighter. I see it now. Looks like a soul force glow. The Archmage keeps an office up here, doesn't he? Yes, to stay close to the king. Let's check it out. Frederick eased closer, his grip tight on Lizenwar's hilt. He pushed the door open and lunged through. No enemies waited, just a simple room with a desk, chair, bed, and bookcase. A scroll sitting on the desk was the source of the light. Someone sent a message. Lon approached the desk and reached for it. Hey, I doubt that's intended for you. So do I, but the guy it was intended for is dead, so someone has to look at it. Lon waved a hand over the scroll, banishing the glow, and unrolled it. Uh-oh. What? The Ice Queen's advancing her army south. We need to take this to the king. Andrew and Helena waited at the bottom of the ladder below the entrance to the safe house. When Lydia had informed them that Frederick was on his way, they both raced to meet him. Andrew had known Helena for 5 years, and he'd never seen her this excited. Her cheeks had a rosy glow, and her smile about split her face. You'd think she and Frederick had been separated for weeks, not hours. The full weight of the situation hit him then. Had it only been half a day ago that his main concern was talking some girl into his bed? It felt like another life, and in some ways it was, especially after Lydia's announcement about his father. He put the thought out of his mind. What would be, would be. Right now, he needed to greet his friend. Frederick climbed down the ladder, and the instant his feet hit the stone, Helena leapt into his arms. He held her and took a couple steps to make a space for the sorcerer hovering above him to land. Frederick's face was twisted in a deep scowl. Considering the beautiful woman in his arms, Andrew couldn't imagine what was wrong. Finally, he lowered Helena and asked, Is your father awake? I don't know. Andrew's chest got heavy. Why? Frederick looked back at the sorcerer. Lon, Lon held out a scroll. Andrew read it, and his eyes widened. "Is this accurate?" "I assume so," Lon said. "When we checked the second floor, we found it on the Archmage's desk. Only one of our sorcerers would know exactly where to send it." "What's going on?" Helena asked, looking from one face to the other. "War." Andrew strode back toward his father's bedroom. Even if he wasn't up, there was no way he could keep this from him. Hopefully, Lydia would be there as well. As they walked, Frederick filled them in on the details. When he finished, Helena asked, "Was this all a distraction so we wouldn't be able to respond quickly?" "It was more than that," Andrew said, his mind racing. "If she'd succeeded in killing the king, heir to the throne and the commander of the Northern Army, the chaos would have been enormous. Her army would roll over ours like they were nothing. We were damn lucky today." They reached the door, and Andrew asked the guards, "Is my father awake?" "Yes, Highness," one of the sorcerers said. "The Archmage is with him." "Did he have another coughing spell?" "Yes, Highness." Andrew grimaced and nodded. They opened the door for him, and he went in. Lydia bent over the bed, her hands glowing as she made mystic passes over his father's chest. Both of them looked his way. Andrew didn't have a chance to say anything about the invasion before his father said, "Frederick, come here." Frederick approached the bed and bowed. "Majesty."
"I didn't really have a chance to thank you properly back at the capital. You saved my life. Any reward you desire, simply name it."
Andrew allowed himself a moment of amusement at his friend's discomfort. Frederick hated this sort of thing. "I was only doing my duty, Majesty. No reward is necessary." Father managed a weak smile.
"So like Dornkirk. I will miss him. He was as loyal a protector as a man could hope for. That's it. You still carry the demon sword. I hereby name you its official bearer. Dornkirk would have liked that, and you've certainly proven yourself adept in its use."
"I appreciate that, Majesty. But what will the generals say?" Father snorted.
"If they have someone better able to wield it, they could challenge you to single combat. Having seen you fight, I suspect it won't happen twice."
Frederick bowed again, and Andrew cleared his throat.
"A matter of some urgency has come to my attention, Father." "Don't keep me in suspense." "The Ice Queen is advancing her forces south."
Andrew held out the scroll, but his father waved him over to Lydia.
"Details are a little vague, but the situation sounds urgent."
Lydia finished reading the scroll and lowered it.
"It certainly does. Not to mention we have an inexperienced general in command."
The king sat up.
"I will assume command."
Andrew's heart leapt into his throat.
"Father, you mustn't. Your illness—" "I'm dying," Father said.
Andrew shot a look at Lydia, and she gave a faint shake of her head.
"No, she said nothing." Father smiled a humorless smile. "I've suspected for some time given Samhair's inability to cure me. I accept it. This is something I can do before the end. Seeing me at the head of the army will give the men heart, and I'll be damned if I let that dragon's schemes cost us the northern territories."
Andrew knew that tone well. There was no arguing with him. Part of Andrew understood his father's point of view. The king's presence would bolster the men's morale. The overprotective son in him simply wanted his father safe and well, but the prince understood. "Allow me to guard you in my father's place, Majesty," Frederick said.
"I would be honored to have you at my side," Father said. "There are preparations to be made. I want to be away by noon."
Deep in his heart, Andrew knew his father was going to die for the kingdom. He held back the tears until he was alone. It appeared the dragon would succeed in killing the king after all. At the king's command, everyone cleared the room, leaving Andrew and his father alone. Frederick envied his friend a chance to say goodbye. Frederick hadn't been especially close to his own father. Dornkirk St. Cloud wasn't exactly known for his soft and loving nature. Nevertheless, all that he was, Frederick owed to his father's teaching. He'd missed that steady presence, if nothing else. He walked through the dull, gray tunnels beside Helena, not really thinking of a destination. Frederick had no idea what he was supposed to do to prepare. He had nothing beyond the clothes on his back and the demon sword, so all he really needed to do was join the others when they were ready. Helena rested a hand on his back, dragging him out of his reverie. Are you okay? You looked a million miles away for a second there. Sorry, just thinking about my father, the king, and all of us. Nothing's going to be the same after this. War always changes everything. Helena slid her arm around his waist. We'll always have each other. He stopped and looked down at the top of her blonde hair. For maybe the first time in his life, Frederick acted without thinking it through. Marry me. Helena looked into his eyes and smiled. I thought you'd never ask. I will. Do you want to do it now or when we get back? It shamed him to admit he'd harbored thoughts of asking her to remain behind. He loved Helena and wanted her safe, but she was as much a warrior as Frederick himself. There would be no future for them if he ever lost sight of that. When we get back, if what I fear is going to happen does, it will be nice to have something good to look forward to, and I can think of nothing better than pledging the rest of my life to you. They shared a kiss and went to the exit ladder to wait. An hour later, King Adam, dressed in fine clothes and looking steadier than Frederick had seen him in a while, arrived, along with Andrew, Lon, and the Crimson Legionnaires.
Andrew, the king said, you will remain here until this matter is settled. Lydia, you and all but 2 of your sorcerers will protect them. The rest of us will fly north with all haste.
Father, please. The king gave his son a hard look.
You will stay here until it's safe. Is that understood?
Andrew hung his head. Yes, father.
Good.
King Adam took his son by the shoulder.
When I'm gone, the people will look to you for leadership. I know you don't think you're up to it, but you have a good heart. Follow it, and you'll do fine. I love you, son.
Andrew finally looked up.
I love you, too.
Frederick tried to remember if his father had ever told him he loved him, and failed. Even knowing what the future most likely held, he envied his friend more than he could say. Frederick, Helena, and Lon flew together in a soul force bubble while the king traveled with the legionnaires. The sun was high in the sky and Frederick held back a yawn. He hadn't gotten a bit of sleep the night before. It wasn't a big deal. Warlords sometimes went days without sleep if necessary, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Below them, the great green spread out in every direction. Lon's focus was directed straight ahead. Frederick was hesitant to bother the sorcerer, but curiosity got the best of him. Where did the king find his new strength? Lon glanced his way, then quickly back to where they were going. I'm not sure if I should say. You should, Frederick said. If I'm to protect him, I need to know what I'm dealing with. I suppose that's true. Okay. I overheard the Archmage talking to the other sorcerers. It seemed the king ordered her to infuse him with enough soul force to allow him to function, even if it shortened his life. His orders were to keep him upright no matter what. He has no intention of coming back, Helena said. Frederick nodded and put his arm around her. He felt bad for Andrew, but he held the king in the highest respect. It took a lot of guts to do what he was doing, even if he knew he was already dying. No one felt much like talking after that, and 3 hours later the Northern Army's camp appeared on the horizon. Frederick scanned the area with his enhanced vision and found no sign of the enemy, which was a relief. They'd made it in time to hopefully make a difference. The king's group landed right outside the biggest tent in the compound. Frederick assumed it was the command tent, and soon he was standing beside King Adam and facing a pair of wide-eyed boys who hastened to take a knee. Not daring to look up, the boys reached out blindly and pulled the flaps open. The king's stride was firm as he stepped through the opening. Frederick studied him out of the corner of his eye. If he hadn't seen the king on what had at the time appeared to be his deathbed, Frederick would have never guessed there was anything wrong with him. Of course, as a warlord, he couldn't see soul force, so whatever boost the Archmage had given him was invisible, and would likely be so to the vast majority of the soldiers in the army. That was the most important thing. Standing behind a table spread with a map was a burly man in his mid-20s. He looked up when they entered and immediately took a knee. Majesty, I didn't expect you to come yourself when I sent my report.
Rise and tell me what's going on.
Yes, Majesty. He straightened and took a moment to collect himself. It wasn't often a man found himself in the presence of his king. I'm Commander Cord, General Cord, now I've been told. I served as General Cord Right Second, and I'm fully aware of his battle plans.
That's excellent, General, the king said with exaggerated patience. Now answer my question. Right. Well, our scouts inform us that there's a mixed force of ogres and trolls numbering between 10 and 15,000 headed for the Central Pass here. The general pointed at a spot on the map around 30 miles from their current position. 2 smaller groups numbering between 3 and 5,000 are headed for the eastern and western passes. What they lack in numbers they make up for with frost giants, 15 in each group. And our forces? The king asked. Right now I have 20,000 regular infantry, 250 warlords, and 6 sorcerers. Duke Iceborne is sending reinforcements which will double that, and I received confirmation that the Tower is sending another 15 sorcerers. They should be here by dark. The soldiers are 3 days out. So a roughly even fight, wouldn't you say, General? General Cord looked everywhere but at the king. He clearly had no desire to correct his ruler, but there was a glaring fact that needed to be pointed out. Frederick saw it at once and took pity on the new general. If we were fighting other men, it would be, Frederick said. But an ordinary man is no match for an ogre one-on-one. We can hold the Central Pass with little difficulty, but it'll take every man we have fighting in a phalanx along with flying squads of warlords to reinforce any weak spots in the line. Right, General? General Cord shot him a grateful look. Exactly. Even if we hold the Central Pass, it won't do us any good if we're flanked by the other groups. I see, the king said. What's your plan, General? I was working on that when you arrived, Majesty. We need to attack the 2 flanking groups with our current force while the reinforcements take up position near the border to hold off the main force. Frederick studied the map. It wasn't a bad plan, assuming the Duke's troops arrived in time. The survivors of the initial assaults could fall on the rear of the main enemy force, trapping it between them. Frederick? The king asked. The plan is solid, but risky. It all comes down to the reinforcements. They'll have a hard time facing the main force outside the pass since they won't be able to concentrate their numbers, but I can find no other realistic options. Nor can I, King Adam nodded once. So be it. Divide your forces as you see fit, General. I'll command the western assault. Yes, Majesty. We should leave at first light so we'll at least have the benefit of the arriving sorcerers. Agreed. Find me a tent. I'd like to rest. General Cord barked orders, and soon enough a footman arrived to escort them to a nearby tent. Frederick didn't ask who they'd evicted, since no one would dare complain about giving up their lodgings for the king. This far north, a foot of snow already covered the ground. White surrounded them on all sides. Frederick marched at the front of the army with the other warlords, breaking a path. In the center of the formation, Helena and the Crimson Legionnaires stayed close to the king. The sorcerers used their power to protect him from the cold. Frederick had managed 4 hours' sleep the night before, and it made a world of difference. His enhanced strength made the foot of snow little more than a minor inconvenience. Since the enemy blended into an environment like this, he relied on his ears and nose to alert him to danger. He didn't really expect an attack considering the size of their numbers, but then again he hadn't expected ogre assassins either. He heard the sorcerer approaching before he saw her. A flash of gold appeared as she landed near the king. Frederick caught the eye of the warlord commanding the lead group and nodded back the way he'd come. A quick sprint brought him to King Adam's side. The sorcerer straightened from her bow. They're coming straight for us, Majesty, as fast as they can run. How far to the mouth of the pass? The king asked. About a mile, the sorcerer said. Can we beat them there? She grimaced. Maybe. They're moving awfully quick. It'll be a near thing either way. Let me take 100 warlords, Frederick said. We can hold the opening until you arrive. Do it, and take the sorcerers with you. You'll need them to handle any frost giants. Frederick bowed and turned to Helena. Ready? She raised her spear, and they took off to collect the others. At warlord speed, it took less than a minute to reach the opening of the pass. Warlords were the best and most experienced warriors in the kingdom. They needed no orders from Frederick, spreading themselves across the opening. Relatively narrow, near-vertical walls of stone bracketed a pass 50 yards across. Above them, 7 sorcerers hung in the air, ready to deflect any attack from the frost giants. He wouldn't deny a few more would have been nice, but the legionnaires wouldn't leave the king's side, nor should they. They'd make do with what they had.
Howls and savage snarls echoed up the pass. He tightened his grip on the demon sword. Lisenwar hadn't spoken to him since he took up the blade after his father's death. The sword wasn't a subject he often spoke to his father about, so he had no idea if the spirit's silence was a normal thing or if she'd changed her mind about accepting him. If she had changed her mind, this was a hell of a time to let him know. Out of the white, a fang-filled face appeared surrounded by scraggly black hair. Hundreds more appeared behind it. He'd read about ice trolls, but had never seen one. Shorter than ogres, the ugly, long-nosed brutes healed from anything less than a lethal strike in minutes. The enemy was less than 50 yards away when Helena reached out and took his hand. Frederick squeezed back. Much as he would have liked her to be safe, there was no one he'd prefer to go to battle with. 15 yards away, ropes of saliva became visible as the eager monsters rushed forward. A surge of power from the demon sword filled him with strength and confidence. Lisenwar hadn't forsaken him. With her power backing him, Frederick felt like he could defeat any enemy. Frederick focused on the nearest clump of trolls and accelerated to lightning speed. Killing at this speed was more like harvesting grain. The enemy appeared to be standing still. He swung the demon sword with precision, and a blade far sharper than steel had any right to be took the head of every troll he saw. Beside him, Helena moved in slow motion, her spear piercing hearts and eyes, blonde hair flying as she went. She was so beautiful. An 8-foot-tall ogre in a dragon mask appeared beside her. It raised an ice club. He knew in an instant she wouldn't have time to defend herself. Frederick shifted left and lunged. He hit the berserker like a ballista bolt, knocking it away and piercing its chest. Standing on the corpse of the ogre gave him a view of the rest of the battle. The warlords were holding their own, but at least a handful of blue uniforms littered the ground. Deeper in the pass, sorcerers exchanged blasts with the frost giants. So far they managed to keep the massive creatures from launching any ice boulders at them. He doubted the fully engaged warlords would be able to dodge. He turned back and squinted into the glare. Spear tips glinted in the light. The rest of the army was close. They only needed to hold out for another minute or two. Frederick re-entered the fray at lightning speed. Not a single troll would slip past him. He swore it. Frederick sat on the corpse of the berserker he killed to save Helena and took slow, deep breaths. The monsters fought like mad things, never backing up, eagerly clawing over the bodies of their comrades to reach the humans. There was no retreat. They simply fought until they were all dead. Unfortunately, there were plenty of men littering the red snow as well. They'd lost nearly half their force holding the pass, including 2 sorcerers felled by the giants. At least Helena had survived, though she'd taken several minor and rapidly healing wounds. Frederick himself hadn't even gotten a scratch. He'd never sustained lightning speed for so long, and only managed to do so this time because of the demon sword empowering him. All in all, he'd call it a victory, albeit a costly one. "Frederick!" Helena waved to him as she approached. She'd offered to check on King Adam when she saw how tired he was. "He wants you." Frederick sighed and hopped down off his lumpy, stiffening chair. "Is the king okay?" "Fine. He's bearing up far better than I'd expected, given the circumstances. I think he was a little annoyed that the Legionnaires wouldn't let him move closer to the front lines. But other than that, I can't see anything wrong." He trudged toward the clearing where they'd set up a field hospital for the wounded. It wasn't much, but those with healing skills did what they could for the injured. When they arrived, King Adam was walking along the rows of bandaged soldiers, offering a word of comfort or encouragement to each. They kept their distance until he reached the end of a row. When he was clear of the wounded, Frederick bowed. "You called me, Majesty." "Yes. Commander Warwick informed me that you distinguished yourself in battle today. I wanted to offer my thanks. Your father would be proud." "Thank you. In some ways, this battle was easier than the duel with the berserker back in the capital. We're extremely lucky our enemies don't have many warriors like that one." "I second that," the king smiled. "If more should appear, at least we have warlords like you to defeat them." A sorcerer came hurtling out of the sky and slammed into the ground 10 yards away. He scrambled to his feet and hurried over. "Majesty, the main enemy force is breaking through at the central pass. The Duke's forces are in desperate need of help." "I didn't think contact would be made until tomorrow at the soonest," the king said. "No one did," the panting sorcerer said. Duke Iceborne's army made better time than expected on their march north, allowing them to reach the mouth of the pass ahead of schedule. But the enemy force arrived early too. I'm not sure who was more surprised to find the other. King Adam growled in the back of his throat. Frederick, alert the commanders and rally the men. We march as soon as they are ready. Has General Cord been alerted? Yes, Majesty, the sorcerer said. Another messenger was dispatched at the same time I was. If you can hit the enemy at the same time, you might crush them between you as planned. Frederick had heard enough. He vanished at warlord speed to spread the word. It seemed there'd be more fighting today after all. The sounds of battle reached them before the opposing armies came into view. The shouts of men and monsters mingled with the clash of steel on ice. The ragged survivors of the first clash emerged from the evergreens on a low ridge overlooking the wide, flat area that funneled into the central pass leading to the dragon's territory. Enemy forces had pushed the Duke's army back from the entrance and enveloped them. The humans were fighting in a circle surrounded by the more powerful ogres and trolls. It didn't take a tactical genius to understand that at this rate the kingdom forces would be worn down in short order. Beside Frederick, King Adam looked down at the battle. The king hadn't marched back. Even without his lung issue, it would have been too much to ask of a man his age. Instead, he'd flown with the sorcerers. Transporting one extra man bothered them not in the least. We need to get down there. The king turned to Lon, who had become a sort of message-bearer for him. Is General Cord in position yet? I've received no confirmation from his sorcerer yet, Majesty. Damn it. If he doesn't hurry, we'll have no one to rescue. We may need to move in without him. Frederick understood his frustration, but if they attacked on their own, they wouldn't have enough soldiers to do the job. They needed to hit the enemy from both sides. Squinting, Frederick tried to make out how the Duke's force was managing. The heavy infantry was holding, their shields locked and fighting a purely defensive battle. No one could say for sure, but they didn't appear in danger of breaking any time soon. We can afford to wait a little longer, Majesty, Frederick said. Our men are holding strong. Very well, but not too much longer. The king moved a little ways away and fell into conversation with one of the Crimson Legion sorcerers. Frederick could have listened in, but he respected the king's privacy. If something he needed to know came up, he'd be informed. If nothing else, the delay would give their weary soldiers a chance to rest before the final battle. Helena moved to stand beside him, and Lon wandered off, giving them a moment of relative privacy. You handle all this like you were born to it, she said. I was. Frederick didn't take his eyes off the unfolding battle. Father began training me as soon as I was old enough to understand the concept of war. Where other children got stories of princesses and castles, I got tales of military campaigns from the old empire. The only thing I had resembling a toy was a wooden sword. I thought my childhood was bleak. At least my mom gave me a little doll made out of string and straw. She let out a little humorless laugh. How pathetic are we? Our kids will definitely have proper toys. Frederick's heart skipped a beat when she said, our kids. He glanced over at her. Could it be that simple? A wife, kids, family, happiness? It wasn't like either of them had much experience with normal home lives. General Cord is in position. Lon's shout broke him out of the moment. It's about time, the king said. He was seated on a horse made of soul force whose hooves didn't touch the snow. Combat formation. The soldiers gathered in ranks 4 deep. Everyone knew what they had to do. King Adam drew his sword and sliced it forward. Charge! His unnatural mount surged ahead at the front of the line. Frederick and Helena matched his speed easily, and the other warlords gathered around them, forming the tip of the spear. Above them a sorcerer flew, no doubt maintaining an invisible shield around the king. The nearest ogre noticed them just in time to lose its head to the demon sword. After that, Frederick had no more time to think. He cut down anything with blue skin. A troll drew too close to the king and he hacked it up. The battle became a blur of blood and screams. Someone cut him on the arm, but he didn't even slow. When the first human face appeared before him, Frederick finally paused in his killing. Push them back! The king's order rang out over the battle, magnified by the sorcerer hovering over him. Their group joined forces with Duke Iceborne's, and they turned as one to attack the mass of monsters pushing their way out of the mountains. They were now far from the front lines, and Frederick was content to stay beside the king. They'd broken the enemy's momentum. Even from here, he could tell the battle was won. More would die, unfortunately, but the kingdom forces would come out on top. An hour later, his prediction was proven true. Back in the past, the mass of ogres pressing forward turned and broke for home. Frederick had no idea how the Ice Queen punished fleeing soldiers, but it seemed for now they were willing to take their chances with the dragon. A cheer went up from the surviving soldiers, and they chanted the king's name. Frederick sheathed his sword. He turned to congratulate the king, but found him pale and wobbling on his conjured mount. The Crimson Legionnaire protecting him landed and made a pass with his hand. King Adam straightened and gave a full body shake. He muttered something to the sorcerer, who nodded. General Cord pushed his way through the cheering throng, barking orders for pickets to be set in case the monsters changed their minds. When he reached King Adam, he said, "Congratulations, Majesty. We couldn't have won the day without you. Your timing was perfect."
Thank you, General. Things seem to be under control here. I believe I'll return to the capital and let my son know the good news.
"We'll take care of things on this end, never fear." The general saluted and returned to his duties. "Frederick," Lon landed beside him, "that was amazing. I've never seen anyone fight the way you did. It was like the ogres just fell to pieces around you." "It's what I was trained for." Frederick kept his gaze on the king, who spat blood into the snow when he thought no one was looking. Lon thrust out his hand. "It was an honor fighting with you." Frederick gave it a shake. "Likewise. I think we're returning to the capital soon. Good luck with your mission." Lon nodded and flew back up toward the pass. "He doesn't look good." Helena nodded toward King Adam. "No, he doesn't." "What's going to happen now?" It would have been too callous to say, "Now the king dies," but that was almost certainly what was going to happen. Perhaps the king and his champion would be buried together. The two men probably spent more time together than they did with anyone else, so it was oddly appropriate. "Let's go." Frederick took her hand and they walked over to the king and his sorcerers. It was going to be a tough time for Andrew, but he meant to do his best for his friend. Chapter 6. Long Live the King. Frederick sat with Helena in the Soul Force bubble beside a wheezing King Adam. At the king's request, the sorcerers flew outside their transport. The only sounds in the bubble were the gurgles of the king's breathing. Frederick tried to think of something that might break the bleak silence, but nothing came to him. This really wasn't the sort of thing he was comfortable with. Hopefully, just being there and holding Helena would be enough. The king coughed, then said,
"You should have let that troll cut me down. Better I died in battle than drowning in my own blood."
He met the king's pained gaze. "Andrew might not feel that way. I know I would have liked a chance to say goodbye to my father. We weren't exactly close, but stumbling on his headless corpse wasn't the easiest thing in the world to see." The king's lips twisted and he grasped his chest.
"I suppose it wasn't. Your father was a hard man, Frederick, but honorable. I put my life in his hands more than once, and he never gave me cause to regret it. You remind me of him."
Frederick wasn't certain if that was a compliment or not, but he chose to take it that way.
"I have a favor to ask before I die."
"If it's within my power."
"Will you protect Andrew like your father did me?"
"Of course. I've been doing it for a while anyway. For as long as I live, no harm will come to him." The king's head fell back and he sighed.
"Thank you. I thought he'd have more time before he had to take the throne. I'm not sure he's ready."
"I don't know that anyone's ever ready for that sort of responsibility. Andrew's a good man. I think he'll make a good king." King Adam smiled and closed his eyes. Frederick barely heard his faint breathing. They needed to reach the capital quickly if Andrew was to have his chance to say goodbye. In the end, they made it to the royal castle in time. Frederick didn't know what passed between father and son, but when Andrew emerged from the king's chamber, he looked as serious as Frederick had ever seen him. That was 4 days ago. The official period of mourning would last for another 6 days, but they'd held the burial for the king this morning. The dukes, generals, and everyone else that attended had withdrawn to the castle, leaving Frederick and Andrew alone in the royal mausoleum. The niche that held King Adam was engraved with a crown, along with his birth date and death date. He was only 45. Off to the right, but still nearby, was a second seal marked with a vertical sword and the name Dornkirk St. Cloud. Andrew insisted an inscription be added. Frederick traced the words, "Died for his king." Father could have asked for no greater honor. "I'm not sure I'm up to this," Andrew said. His formal robes of state had gathered a layer of dust from leaning against the tomb walls. "I'll tell you what I told your father on our way back to the castle. You're a good man, and will make a good king. I believed it then, and I believe it now. Have a little faith in yourself." Andrew cracked a smile. "He told me. I thought you said it to reassure him." "Maybe that too. We should probably head back." "Yes." Andrew sighed and turned toward the sunlit entrance. "When's the wedding?" "Helena hasn't picked a date yet. She wants to try and contact her parents. I told her whenever she was ready, it was okay with me." They reached the exit, and Andrew stopped. "Could you do me a favor?" Frederick nodded. "When it's just the two of us, would you call me Andy? Father used to call me that when I was little, and I miss it sometimes." Frederick shuddered at the horrid breach of protocol. Still, it was a harmless enough request. "Sure, King Andy. It suits you." "Shut up." Frederick grinned, and the two friends left the dead behind. The noon sun shone down on them as they walked back to the castle. It was a beautiful day to start a new life.
I hope you enjoyed this presentation of The Lightning. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my uploads. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.